My name is Daniel Mercer, and I serve as a park ranger assigned to the Northern District of Ashwood National Park. I have been in this line of work for 11 years, and over that span of time I have come to understand that the forest has its own laws. Laws written not in books or policies, but in the whisper of trees and the silence that follows after dark. My duties are straightforward to anyone looking in from the outside. I patrol trails, enforce rules, tend to injured hikers, and close down campgrounds when the season wanes. What is not written in the job description are the nights when the woods lean in close and remind you that after the gates are locked, something else claims the land. I used to believe my flashlight beam was enough to keep the shadows back, but experience has taught me otherwise. The park in daylight is a sanctuary. Deer grazing by riverbeds, wildflowers painting the meadows, and children racing through trails their grandparents once hiked. At dusk, however, when the last vehicles roll down the asphalt toward town, and the sound of laughter fades into the distance, the air changes. It is subtle at first, like the woods taking a slow breath in. But after that breath, silence falls too heavy, too complete, as if every living thing is listening. That silence has weight, and when you spend enough years working past closing hours, you learn to respect it. I remember the first week I was put on closing patrol alone. My partner at the time, Ranger Lyle Carver, slapped me on the back and told me not to overthink it. Just lock the gates, check the trailheads, and radio in before midnight, he said. The woods may creak, but they won't bite. He was wrong. I have never said that to his face, but I know now he was wrong. The woods bite, and they bite hard. The first bite came one September night, when I was driving the service road back toward the maintenance shed. A figure stood in my headlights, too tall to be a hiker, too still to be a deer. Its arms hung too low, brushing against its knees. I braked hard, fumbling for the radio. When the light swept over the figure again, it was gone. Lyle laughed when I told him, said it was just nerves. I laughed along to hide my unease, but the truth is that I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror the entire way back. Years later, I still see things that do not make sense. Some I can explain. Wind through hollow logs, tricks of moonlight, owls that sound like crying children. Others defy reason. And tonight, as I write this into my log, I think about how the strangest nights often begin quietly, with nothing unusual at all. The park had just closed for the season. Only staff were permitted beyond the gates, and even then, only rangers with clearance. I was tasked with one of the last patrols before winter officially settled in. My route took me along the Northern Loop, a stretch of trail known for steep switchbacks, and a lake that mirrored the sky like black glass. I parked the truck by the trailhead, checked the lock on the gate, and slung my pack across my shoulder. The air smelled sharp, pine-saturated, like the forest itself was freshly cut. Above, the stars blinked cold and clean. The first mile passed without incident. My boots crunched over gravel, and the beam of my flashlight bounced along the path ahead. I carried a sidearm, though rangers rarely had cause to use one, and my radio buzzed faintly with the static of distant chatter. By the second mile, the quiet settled heavy. I paused, holding my breath, listening. No wind, no insects, no trickle of the usual creek beside the trail, just the sound of my own breathing. I tapped the radio. Ranger Mercer checking in. Northern Loop clear so far. Static hissed back at me, swallowing the words whole. I frowned. Reception could be poor up here, but the complete absence of reply scraped against my nerves. I kept moving. At the third mile, I saw it. A lantern light flickering through the trees off to my right. Too high up to be a campfire, too steady to be a reflection. No one was supposed to be out here. I angled my light toward it, but the glow did not dim or scatter like a beam against fog. It held its shape, pale and deliberate. "This is Ranger Mercer," I called, my voice breaking the silence in a way that felt wrong. "The park is closed. You need to come out." The light swayed once, then vanished. I forced myself forward, though my gut told me to turn back. Branches clawed at my jacket as I pushed through the brush, reaching the spot where the light had been. Nothing. No lantern. No person. Just the smell of damp earth and a patch of leaves pressed down, as if someone had been standing there for a long while. My heart thudded hard against my ribs. I circled the area twice, shining the beam over every tree trunk. No footprints, no broken branches, only the feeling that I was being watched. When I returned to the trail, my truck keys felt heavy in my pocket, an anchor I could almost run toward. But duty held me steady. I had to finish the patrol. I told myself it could have been a reflection from a hunter's lamp left behind, or maybe even a trick of my own light. I pressed forward, though each step felt like it landed inside someone else's breath. By the time I reached the overlook above Blackwater Lake, I could not shake the thought that I had been led here. The lake stretched wide and flat, reflecting the stars, but the reflection was wrong. I leaned against the rail, squinting down at the water. The sky above me carried a half moon, but the reflection in the water showed none. Just stars, endless and cold. My breath fogged in front of me, though the air was not that cold. I whispered my own name, testing the silence. It came back softer from the lake itself, as if the water had swallowed it and given it back in a thinner voice. My flashlight sputtered once, dimming before returning to life. I turned sharply half, expecting to find someone behind me. No one. Only the whisper of leaves. The walk back was worse. Every 100 yards, I heard the crunch of another pair of boots behind me, close enough that I expected to feel a hand on my shoulder. I spun around twice, light cutting into the dark. Nothing. My radio popped faintly, a voice warbling through static. "Don't close." That was all I could make out. My throat went dry. I didn't key the mic. I just kept walking. Faster, until the trailhead came into sight. The truck sat where I left it, but something about the way it waited felt wrong, like a prop placed on a stage. The driver's door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I always lock it. I climbed inside, shut the door, and turned the ignition. The headlights flared, catching movement at the tree line. Figures, 3 of them, stood just beyond the reach of the light. Tall, still watching. My chest tightened. I slammed the truck into gear and pulled onto the road. When I glanced back through the mirror, the figures were gone, as if they had never been there. I didn't breathe easy until I reached the ranger station. Even then, when I stepped out of the truck, the night felt wrong. The air carried no insect song, no rustle of small animals. The silence pressed against the windows of the station, heavy and patient. I locked the door behind me and sat at the desk, forcing my hands to stop shaking long enough to write the log entry. My handwriting trailed unevenly across the page, the words breaking into scratches. I tried to rationalize, to piece the night into something that could be explained. But there are no explanations that satisfy. I saw the lantern. I heard my own voice returned from the water. I know the door was locked, and I know I saw them. Those tall, still figures at the tree line. This was not the first time strange things have happened after closing. It will not be the last. And though I am still a ranger, sworn to protect the park and the people who pass through it, I know deep down that after the gates are shut, it is no longer our park. It belongs to them. The next morning I stood on the station porch with a mug of burnt coffee, watching mist lift off the pines. Sleep hadn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the lantern swaying and the figures waiting just beyond my headlights. I told myself I'd imagined most of it, but the weight in my chest didn't ease. I've learned over the years that silence in the woods is rarely innocent. When the forest withholds its voice, it is because something else is speaking, something you cannot hear until it wants you to. Lyle showed up around 9, stamping his boots against the porch. He grinned like he always did, that same grin that once made me believe this job was just a long hike with a paycheck. "You look like hell," he said, sipping from his thermos. I didn't tell him the truth. I just said I hadn't slept. He didn't need to know about the voices or the figures. Or maybe I didn't want him to know, because admitting it aloud would cement it into something more than a nightmare. He clapped my shoulder and said he'd take the southern loop, leaving me to cover the north again that night. I didn't argue. Duty was duty, and avoiding the northern loop would feel like weakness. By dusk, I was back in the truck, headlights carving tunnels through the fog that pooled low to the ground. The gate locks clicked heavy under my gloves, and the sound carried too far in the stillness. I swept my beam over the empty trailhead, half expecting to see someone waiting in the trees. Nothing. I started down the path. The forest swallowed me whole within minutes. It always amazed me how quickly the world shrank when night fell out here. My flashlight showed only 10 feet ahead, my own boots the only sound. Every turn felt sharper, every branch more deliberate. A mile in, my radio crackled. This time the static didn't swallow the voice completely. Daniel Mercer. My name drawn out slow. My knees locked mid-step. The channel was clear. No one was supposed to be broadcasting. I raised the mic. "Identify yourself." Static. Then faint laughter, brittle and wrong. Too close to a child's giggle, but layered, like several voices stacked. I flicked the dial to another channel. Dead air. I turned the unit off, heart hammering. I should have turned back, but the lake was only 2 miles farther, and leaving the route unchecked would mean riding up a false log. I pressed on. The trail narrowed near the ridge, and I saw the first sign that I wasn't alone. Mud smeared across the rocks, long streaks like someone dragging their hands. They ran parallel to the trail, fingers spread wide, nails gouging grooves deep into the soil. I crouched to touch one. Still damp, still fresh. My breath fogged, though the air wasn't cold enough. That same wrongness prickled at my neck. The path wound down toward Blackwater Lake, and by the time I reached the overlook, moonlight silvered the surface. I froze when I saw it. A lantern stood at the water's edge, burning steady. The glow cut a straight column into the black. No figure held it this time. It simply stood upright, perfectly balanced. My voice caught in my throat. I forced out words anyway. "This is a restricted area. Whoever is down there, you need to leave." Nothing. The lantern did not sway. I clicked my radio on again despite the dread. Ranger Mercer reporting. Possible trespassers near Blackwater. Static hissed. But buried inside was my own voice, repeating the words back half a second delayed, like a mocking echo. I shut it off and felt bile rise in my throat. I couldn't stop staring at the lantern. Something in me, curiosity, duty, or plain stubbornness, pushed me to move closer. I descended the slope, boots sliding on loose dirt. Halfway down, the lantern went out. Darkness smothered everything. I lifted my flashlight, beam cutting the shore. No lantern, no footprints, just wet stones shining like glass. My lungs ached with every breath. The lake was too still, too perfect, as if painted. I turned in a slow circle, every muscle locked tight. That was when I heard the boots again. Behind me on the trail, 1 step, then 2. Smeasured. I swung the flashlight up. The beam caught the slope, but nothing stood there. The sound stopped. My chest heaved. I scrambled back up, nearly slipping twice, and reached the overlook rail. The forest beyond the trail was darker than before. Shadows pooled so thick my light barely penetrated. Then the beam hit something. A figure tall, standing between the trees, arms brushing its knees. Same as before. It didn't move, didn't flinch when the light struck. My breath rattled out. I blinked once, twice, and it was gone. I staggered backward against the rail, pulse roaring in my ears. The hike back was a blur. I kept the light on the trail, refusing to look sideways no matter how many times I heard twigs snap or whispers bleed through the static of my radio, even though it was off. By the time the truck appeared through the trees, I nearly broke into a run. The driver's door was locked this time, thank God, but when I climbed in, the passenger seatbelt was buckled. I hadn't touched it. My throat tightened. I unlatched it with a shaking hand, then turned the key and gunned the engine. The road twisted through dark pines, and halfway to the station, the headlights swept across something that made my stomach drop. Every tree trunk bore a mark, tall, thin circles gouged deep into the bark, repeating in a pattern too precise to be random. Each circle looked like an open mouth, hundreds of them staring as I drove past. I gripped the wheel hard, refusing to slow down. The marks blurred into streaks in my peripheral vision, but I knew they'd still be there come daylight. The forest had shown me its teeth. When I reached the station, the lot was empty. Lyle's truck wasn't back yet. I parked fast, rushed inside, and locked the door. My hands trembled as I scribbled the report, but I didn't know what to write. Suspicious activity felt too small. Trespassers didn't cover it. I left the page half finished, words trailing into scratches. Outside, the night pressed against the windows again. Heavy, waiting. My radio powered down, popped once from across the room. Then my voice spilled out, warped and soft, saying words I hadn't spoken. Don't close the park. The radio never should have spoken on its own, but it did. I sat frozen at the desk, pen in hand, staring at the metal box like it had grown teeth. The voice had been mine, but the words weren't. I hadn't said them. I hadn't even thought them. The silence afterward pressed in until I couldn't breathe. I shoved the log aside and stood, pacing the length of the small station. My boots thumped too loudly against the floorboards. I half expected the voice to start again, to whisper something else I wasn't ready to hear, but the radio remained still, dead, silent. When Lyle's truck finally pulled into the lot near midnight, relief hit me so hard I nearly stepped outside. But I stopped short at the door. Something in me recoiled at the thought of leaving the safety of walls and light. Instead, I watched through the window as he climbed out, stretched his arms, and carried his gear inside. His grin cracked the tension in the air for a moment. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, tossing his hat onto the hook by the door. "Something's wrong out there," I said. My voice was too sharp, too thin. He paused, frowning. I told him about the lantern, the footprints that weren't there, the voice on the radio. I even admitted to seeing the figures. His expression shifted from skepticism to something grimmer, though he tried to hide it with a shrug. "You've been working too many night loops," he said. "Fatigue'll play tricks." "Those weren't tricks." I meant to sound firm, but the tremor in my voice betrayed me. He didn't argue. That silence told me enough. Maybe he'd seen things too, things he didn't want to give power to by saying aloud. He poured himself coffee and sat across from me, talking about mundane patrol reports until the clock crawled toward 2 in the morning. He stayed the night in the spare cot, though neither of us slept well. I dreamed of the lake whispering my name, water lapping at my ankles, and a lantern swaying just out of reach. The next day should have been simple. Routine maintenance, paperwork, trail closures, yet the woods didn't let go of me. I carried the unease like a second skin. Every gust of wind sounded like words. Every raven perched too long felt like a sentinel. Lyle noticed but didn't say anything. That silence was its own kind of confession. By dusk, I found myself driving the northern road again. I told myself I just needed closure, proof that nothing waited there when the sun fell. But part of me knew the forest wanted me back, drawing me in like gravity. I parked at the trailhead, locked the truck, checked twice, then slung my pack over my shoulder. The light was thin, bleeding orange through the branches. Shadows stretched long across the ground, too long, like they were reaching for me. The first mile passed under a hush so complete it rang in my ears. I stopped once, knelt, and touched the dirt. No prints, no signs of life, not even the scurry of a mouse. It was like the forest had emptied itself out. When I straightened, I realized I could hear something faint ahead, soft metal tapping, like chain links brushing together. It carried through the trees, steady, rhythmic. I followed. The sound grew clearer until I reached a bend where the trail overlooked a dry creek bed. There, swaying from a branch 10 feet above, hung a lantern. No flame, no bulb. Just a shell of rusted metal creaking in the still air. The tapping came from its handle brushing the bark. My flashlight beam fell across it, catching flecks of old soot inside. The sight rooted me to the ground. The lantern swayed once, then stopped. Branches cracked behind me. I spun, light sweeping over the brush. Nothing. My pulse hammered. I turned back. The lantern was gone. Not fallen, not swinging, just gone. I stumbled back a step, nearly tripping over a root. My radio, clipped to my shoulder strap, hissed alive even though it was still turned off. My voice spilled out again, flat and cold. See. Keep walking. I tore it off and threw it into the dirt. The static cut off, but the words lingered in my head. I didn't want to follow, but my legs carried me forward anyway, as if the forest had taken hold of my muscles. By the time I reached Blackwater Lake, the moon was high, thin light draped across the water. I froze at the shoreline. Dozens of lanterns lined the bank, each burning pale white, their reflections shivering in the still surface. They were spaced evenly, like sentinels, forming a ring around the lake. The sight hollowed me out. No one could have set them up in the time it took me to walk here. No one could have lit them. I forced air into my lungs and raised the flashlight. The beam cut across the lake and landed on a figure standing on the opposite bank. Tall, still, arms dangling low, it faced me directly. Even across the distance, I felt its gaze settle heavy on my chest. The lanterns flared brighter, as if feeding on that silent acknowledgement. The water rippled though no wind touched it. My reflection blurred, then sharpened into something not quite me. Its mouth moving, whispering words I couldn't hear. My throat locked. I backed away slowly, refusing to turn. The figure didn't move. It only watched. When I finally reached the tree line, the lanterns flickered out in unison, plunging everything into black. I stumbled up the trail, heart clawing at my ribs. The forest closed in, thicker, heavier. At one point I glanced back. The figure was closer now, standing halfway up the slope, unmoving but undeniable. I forced myself to run. The truck came into view like salvation. I fumbled with the keys, slammed the door, started the engine. Headlights blazed, and caught something that made me slam the brakes. The road was lined with trees, and carved into each trunk were those same circles, dozens more than before, deep grooves glistening like open mouths. And within some of them, lanterns burned. Not hanging, not set on branches, burning inside the bark itself. Flames flickering behind wood, as if the trees were hollow and alive. I floored the accelerator. The road twisted past the glowing trees, their lights trailing after me, chasing, until finally the station lights broke through the dark. I skidded into the lot, killed the engine, and stumbled inside. The air in the station felt too thin, the walls too weak. I locked the door twice and sat at the desk, breathing hard. The radio on the shelf turned on by itself. My voice again, steady this time, not warped. Don't run. Not yet. The voice on the radio drained every ounce of heat from my body. Hearing my own tone, calm and steady, telling me not to run, it was worse than any scream. I couldn't make myself move for a long while. The room felt smaller than it had ever been, the walls closing in, the windows shivering under the weight of the dark. When I finally found the nerve to yank the cord out of the radio, the silence that followed wasn't a relief. It was heavier, charged. My hands shook so bad I dropped the cord twice before it dangled useless on the floor. The box was dead now, no power, no hum, nothing. But even as I stared at it, I half expected my voice to spill out again. I told myself I'd quit in the morning. 11 years in uniform, and suddenly I was ready to leave it all behind. Let the next ranger take the north loop. Let someone else face whatever stood in those trees. But at dawn, when the first light leaked over the ridge, my resolve cracked. A ranger's oath isn't about easy days. It's about staying when it gets hard, when it gets dangerous. And besides, walking away wouldn't matter. I knew, deep down, that whatever had found me wasn't bound by park borders or job titles. That day passed in a haze of exhaustion. Paperwork blurred. Calls with district managers sounded like static. Lyle noticed my silence but didn't press. He'd been on edge too, more than usual. His eyes darted toward the tree line each time he stepped outside. That told me more than his words ever could. We were both being watched, whether he admitted it or not. When dusk fell again, I felt the pull. It wasn't duty this time, it was compulsion, like the woods themselves expected me. The air thickened as the sun bled away, turning the sky to iron. I grabbed my flashlight, sidearm, and radio. This time, before stepping outside, I wrapped the radio in my jacket and shoved it deep in the bottom of my pack, hoping distance might muffle whatever lived in its circuits. The trail greeted me with silence again, only heavier, like a held breath. My boots echoed too sharp against dirt. Every step felt like it traveled farther than it should. The trees loomed taller than yesterday, trunks swelling with the circles carved deep. Some fresh, some oozing sap that glowed faintly, as if the cuts had reached veins. A mile in, I stopped. Ahead, the trail was blocked, not by fallen logs or rock slides, but by a wall of lanterns. Dozens of them, balanced in neat rows across the path, each burning pale white. They stood on the ground, evenly spaced, with no one holding them. I couldn't see past their light. The glow was too strong, too unnatural, bending the shadows into sharp edges. I should have turned around. Instead, I stepped closer. The air grew hotter with each lantern I passed, though no heat touched my skin. The smell of iron filled my nose. I counted as I walked. 1, 2, 3, until the numbers lost meaning. They went on longer than the path could hold, stretching the forest into something bigger than it was. When I reached the last lantern, the forest changed. The trees bent inward, forming an arch overhead. The ground sloped steep, pulling me toward Blackwater Lake again. I didn't choose to walk. My legs carried me. Each step cinched with the crunch of boots behind me, though I didn't dare look back. My breath came shallow, matching a rhythm not my own. The lake lay waiting, but it wasn't the same. Tonight the surface boiled with faint ripples, though no wind stirred. Lanterns floated on the water itself now, drifting in slow circles, their reflections forming patterns I couldn't decipher. And on the far shore, figures waited. Not one, not three, a dozen. Tall, unmoving arms hanging too long. Their heads tilted in unison when my light struck them, like a row of marionettes pulled by the same string. I whispered a curse, more prayer than profanity, and backed toward the tree line. My foot struck something soft. I glanced down. A backpack lay in the dirt, half buried in pine needles. Mud streaked, straps torn. Recognition hit me like ice. I'd seen that bag before in a missing persons report from last year. A college kid, Last seen hiking the North Loop, never found. I dropped the flashlight beam onto the zipper. It was undone, and inside, instead of clothes or gear, lay a rusted lantern. Its glass was cracked, but faint white light blawed through. The figures across the lake stepped forward in perfect unison. One step, then another. The water didn't ripple beneath them. They walked across it as if it were solid ground. Panic clawed up my spine. I grabbed the pack and hurled it into the trees. The lantern inside clanged against a trunk, light flickering. The figures stopped mid-step. For a moment, the lake fell silent. Then, slowly, they turned their heads, every one of them, toward where the bag had landed. Their focus shifted away from me, just enough for my legs to break free. I ran, branches tore at my jacket. Roots rose to snag my boots. My chest burned with each breath. But I didn't stop until the trail opened to the road. My truck waited, headlights catching dust in the air. Relief buckled my knees. I climbed in, locked the doors, started the engine. As the tires rolled over gravel, I glanced at the passenger seat. The seatbelt was buckled again. My throat closed. I slammed the brakes, heart in my mouth. With trembling hands, I reached across and unlatched it. The click echoed too loud in the cab. I didn't look at the mirror. I couldn't. I floored the accelerator and didn't let up until the station lights glared through the trees. Inside, I collapsed at the desk, lungs scraping for air. My pack thudded to the floor, heavy with the radio I'd buried inside. The jacket I'd wrapped around it was damp now, though I hadn't been near water. I unzipped the pack. The radio wasn't inside. In its place was a lantern, cracked glass glowing faintly white. I stumbled back so fast my chair toppled. The lantern's light pulsed, once, twice, like a heartbeat. Then it went out. The radio on the shelf hissed alive. My voice again, softer this time, closer to a whisper. Almost closed. The whisper from the radio lingered long after the static faded, threading through the silence like smoke. Almost closed. I couldn't stop staring at the lantern on the floor. Its cracked glass still faintly glowing, though. I knew I hadn't seen a flame inside. My mind clawed for logic. Someone had planted it, maybe Lyle playing some twisted joke. But no explanation held when the glow pulsed once more, steady and deliberate, like it was answering the beat of my heart. I grabbed the lantern with my gloves, meaning to toss it outside, but the moment my hands closed around it, a shock jolted up my arms. Not pain exactly, more like a surge of memory that wasn't mine. My vision blurred, and suddenly I stood at the lake's edge again. Lanterns floated across the black surface, and the tall figures walked closer, their faces hidden in shadow. I tried to drop it, but my hands wouldn't obey. My voice, my real voice, slipped out in a whisper I didn't control. "Don't shut the gates." The lantern slipped from my grip and shattered on the wooden floor. No glass scattered, no sound of breakage. It just folded into itself, gone, leaving nothing but a damp circle that smelled of iron. I backed into the wall, lungs hiving, eyes darting to the window. The forest pressed against the glass, branches tapping with slow patience. I almost screamed when the door opened, but it was only Lyle. He stopped mid-step when he saw me, pale and shaking, the overturned chair, the wet stain on the floor. His grin didn't come this time. What happened? I wanted to tell him everything, but the words knotted up. "Something's in here," was all I managed. He scanned the room, hand resting near his sidearm. Then, without a word, he grabbed the radio off the shelf. He turned it on. Static. He tested a call to dispatch. No response. His jaw tightened. "Lines are dead." We sat in silence, both of us knowing dead lines weren't a good sign. The forest had cut us off. Lyle finally said, "I'll drive to the southern post. See if the signal works there." "No," I blurted, too fast, too desperate. "Don't go alone." His eyes flicked toward the window, then back at me. He nodded once. Then we go together. The drive was worse than walking the trail. The headlights carved narrow tunnels through the dark, and beyond their reach, the trees leaned close, every trunk scarred with circles. Some of those circles weren't empty this time. Faces stared out from them, pale, hollow-eyed, pressed into the bark like something had swallowed them half through. Their mouths hung open, shaping words I couldn't hear. I gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles burned. "Do you see that?" I asked, though I didn't need confirmation. "I see," Lyle said. His voice was low, flat, stripped of the easy humor he wore like armor. Half a mile from the southern station, the truck jolted to a stop. Not from me braking. Something blocked the road. Lanterns. Dozens of them lined up in neat rows, stretching across the gravel like a glowing fence. They burned white and steady, no smoke, no flicker. I shifted into reverse, but the rear view showed the same wall of lanterns behind us, sealing the road. My chest tightened. We're trapped. Lyle reached for the door handle. "Then we go on foot." I grabbed his arm. "You open that door. They'll be waiting." "They already are," he said, and pulled free. He stepped out into the night, his flashlight beam cutting across the wall of lanterns. The light didn't weaken them. If anything, it seemed swallowed. He took one step forward, then another. The lanterns didn't budge. I followed, because being alone in the cab felt worse than facing what waited outside. The air was heavier here, pressing into my lungs with each breath. I tried circling around, but no matter how I moved, the lanterns seemed to stretch farther, bending the road into something endless. Then they all went out. At once, the darkness that fell wasn't normal. It wasn't the absence of light. It was a thing itself, thick and crushing. My flashlight flickered, sputtered, died. In the black, I heard boots. Dozens of them marching in unison. Too close, too steady. Back to the truck. Lyle hissed. We stumbled blind until our hands struck metal. We climbed in fast, doors slamming. I tried the ignition. The engine coughed, sputtered, refused. The windshield filled with pale shapes, figures, arms dangling too long, heads tilting watching. Lyle raised his pistol. "Don't," I whispered. My gut screamed that firing would break something we couldn't fix. He froze, weapon trembling in his hands. The figures pressed closer, faces almost clear now. Skin stretched thin, eyes hollow but glinting faint white, like lantern flames burning inside their skulls. One of them stepped forward, placing a hand on the hood. The metal groaned under its weight, though it didn't look heavy. Another leaned close to the driver's side window. Its mouth opened. Light poured out, white and endless. The truck engine roared to life on its own. My hands weren't on the key. The headlights blazed, blinding, and the figures recoiled into the trees. I slammed the accelerator without thinking. The tires screamed, gravel spraying. We shot forward, the road bending, twisting, until the southern station appeared like a mirage through the trees. We didn't stop until we skidded into the lot. The building sat dark, windows black, empty, deserted. I killed the engine, chest heaving. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, Lyle said, "It's not the park." I frowned at him, shaking. "What?" He stared out the windshield, voice hollow. "It's not bound here. It's not about trails or stations or gates. It's us. It followed us in." The words sank cold into my bones. For the first time since this began, I realized leaving the park wouldn't matter. Locking the gates wouldn't matter. Whatever walked the trails at night had already chosen us. And from somewhere inside the southern station, a lantern flickered to life, pale white through the dark window. The lantern glowed from inside the southern station window, steady and pale, though no one had gone in. The sight froze us in place. Every instinct screamed not to open the door, not to step closer, but Lyle gritted his teeth and raised his pistol. "We're can't just sit out here." I wanted to argue, but the truth was worse. We couldn't sit anywhere. The woods pressed in on every side. The figures hadn't followed us into the lot, but I could feel them watching from the tree line. Waiting. The lantern in the window pulsed once, like a heartbeat. We climbed out of the truck together, our boots crunching too loud on gravel. The door of the station was locked. Or maybe it only pretended to be. The moment Lyle twisted the handle, it gave way. The smell that poured out wasn't dust or wood. It was iron and damp stone, the smell of the lake at night. Inside, the air shimmered faintly white. Lanterns lined the desks, the counters, even the floor, though none had existed there before. Their glow threw our shadows long across the walls, and those shadows didn't move right. Mine twitched a second too late when I turned my head. Lyle's lifted its arm when he didn't. I tried not to look at them. My chest tightened as the radio on the desk snapped to life. My voice filled the room, calm and low, almost closed. "One more night. Shut it off," I said, but my feet wouldn't move. Lyle reached for the cord, but before he could touch it, the lanterns all flared. The shadows on the walls peeled away, separating from us, growing taller, their arms brushing their knees. The same forms we'd seen in the trees now rose inside, born from our silhouettes. Lyle fired. The shot rang like thunder in the small room. The shadow that had been his didn't flinch. The bullet punched through the wall, wood splintering. The figure only tilted its head, as though amused. The lanterns dimmed, and in the sudden hush, I heard boots circling outside the station. Not just a few. Dozens.
"We need to go?"
I rasped. My voice felt raw in my throat. We backed toward the door, but the lanterns pulsed again, locking our legs. I couldn't move. My body wasn't mine anymore. The figures stepped closer, arms dangling, faces blurred but eyes burning pale. One leaned near, and in its hollow voice, I heard my own words return to me. "Don't close the park." My chest clenched. The truth bled clear in that moment. They didn't want the gates shut. They wanted them open. They wanted the woods unbound, the paths free to swallow more than hikers and campers. My knees buckled. Lyle spat on the floor, defiant to the last. Over my dead body, the lanterns blazed so bright the air itself hummed. Our shadows tore completely free. Mine reached for me, its hand long-fingered, almost brushing my chest. Pain lanced through me, cold and sharp, like something was tugging loose from the marrow. I screamed, though the sound came out muffled, strangled. Then the light faltered. Just for a second, but enough. Lyle shoved me hard toward the door, and the shove broke whatever grip held my legs. We staggered outside into the night. The figures in the trees leaned forward, dozens of them, eyes flaring white. The lantern in the window flickered, dying, but only because the rest had already spread outside. Lanterns glowed in every tree circle now. Hundreds. The forest burned with their pale fire, no smoke, no heat, just endless watching light. And from each circle, faces pressed outward, mouths open in silent screams. Some I recognized. The college kid, a lost hiker from last spring. One wore a ranger's badge. My stomach lurched. Lyle grabbed my arm. "Truck! Now!" We ran. Boots thundered behind us. Too many to count, too steady to be human. The cab door barely slammed shut before the first figure reached the lot, pale eyes flaring against the headlights. The engine roared again on its own, like the forest itself wanted us moving. I floored it, gravel spitting, tires screaming. The road twisted, but it no longer felt like the park road. It stretched wrong, bent under the glow of countless lanterns lining the trees. Figures walked beside us, keeping pace no matter how fast I pushed the accelerator. Their faces leaned close to the glass, mouths opening, light spilling out. Lyle clutched the dash, pale. "We can't outrun it." I knew he was right. The park wasn't a place anymore. It was a mouth, and it had swallowed us whole, but instinct is stubborn. I drove until the gates appeared ahead, iron bars glinting under the high beams. Salvation. I slammed the brakes, skidding to a stop. The padlock hung broken, swinging gently. The gates stood wide open. We stared. Beyond them, the road into town stretched quiet and empty. No lanterns, no figures. Just darkness the way it should be. Lyle said. His voice cracked, but something in me froze. The gates weren't open for us to leave. They were open for everything else to come through. If we crossed, we'd drag the forest with us. I could feel it in my bones, in the way my shadow twitched against the cab door, eager to slip free. Lyle grabbed the handle, ready to jump out. I caught his wrist. "They'll tear us apart if we stay," he hissed. "If we leave, they'll follow. They'll never stop." The headlights flickered. Figures gathered behind us now, a wall of pale eyes and long arms filling the road. The lanterns burned brighter, their glow bleeding into the air, erasing the line between forest and sky. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe instinct. Maybe the oath I swore. I threw the truck into reverse, ramming it hard into the gatepost. Metal screamed. The iron gates shuddered, then crashed together with a thunderous clang. The lanterns flared once in fury, then every light winked out. Darkness fell. True darkness. The figures were gone. The trees stood silent still. The road behind us was empty. The forest breathed again, alive with the faint rustle of wind through branches, the chirp of insects returning like a choir. My chest heaved, lungs burning, but for the first time in nights, the silence was natural. Lyle sat stiff in the passenger seat, pistol shaking in his lap. He finally let out a ragged laugh, bitter and broken. "You closed it?" I stared at the iron gates through the mirror, locked tight now, chained in place though no one had touched them. My voice felt hollow as I answered, "For tonight." We drove back to the station in silence. The lantern stain was gone from the floor. The radio sat dead and empty. But I know better than to believe it's over. The forest doesn't forget. The figures will wait. And one night, the gates will swing open again, and someone else will hear their own voice whisper from the dark. Until then, I'll keep the patrol. I'll keep the gates locked. And I'll pray that when the forest decides it wants out, I'm not the one standing watch. My name is Daniel Whitaker. I am 34 years old, married for 7 years, and I live with my wife, Eleanor, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I work as a surveyor, spending much of my time outdoors, while Eleanor teaches at a local elementary school. We have always shared an appreciation for nature. The woods, the ridges, the deep rivers, all of it felt like a quiet inheritance from the state we both called home. Neither of us had ever been the type to crave nightlife or big cities. We saved for vacations that led us deeper into forests, not out of them. So when we decided to spend a week camping in a remote section of northern Pennsylvania, it was not out of character. What happened there, however, was nothing we could have anticipated, and I find myself compelled to put it into words, even though every sentence feels like reopening something that has not truly closed. Our plan was simple. Eleanor had the last week of summer break free, and I had arranged time off work. We packed the essentials: tent, sleeping bags, food supplies, my old Coleman stove, and a few comforts Eleanor insisted on, like her paperback novels and a soft blanket she refused to leave at home. We decided against staying in a designated campground. I had scouted a less traveled area months earlier while working deep in Susquehannock State Forest. It was far from the maintained trails, a place where the trees seemed to close in tighter, and you could walk half a day without crossing another person. I had marked a clearing on my survey map, close to a creek, that seemed ideal for camping. Eleanor agreed. The idea of isolation, of being removed from people and noise, sounded like the reset we both needed. The drive took nearly 4 hours. By the time we left paved roads and turned onto gravel, civilization was already behind us. The GPS signal blinked out. Our phones lost reception, reduced to useless rectangles. Eleanor laughed when she noticed and said, "Guess we're really alone now." I smiled, but inside I felt a small ripple of unease. I was used to this kind of silence, but there was a difference between being alone for work in daylight and choosing to sleep far from anyone for nights on end. Still, I kept that thought to myself. I didn't want to dampen Eleanor's excitement. When we finally parked the truck on a service road, the forest greeted us with a density that felt alive. We carried our gear down a narrow game trail until the trees opened into the clearing I remembered. It was just as I had pictured flat ground for our tent, a canopy that allowed patches of sunlight, and the creek nearby providing water and the steady sound of flow. Eleanor clapped her hands together, delighted. "Perfect," she said, and it did feel perfect, at least at first. We set up camp efficiently. Years of smaller trips had given us a rhythm. I unfolded the tent poles while Eleanor organized the sleeping bags and gear. By late afternoon, everything was in place. We boiled water for tea, sat on a log, and listened to the woods. Birds called in the distance, cicadas droned, and the creek carried on. There was no wind, no sound of cars, no distant hum of towns. Just the layered noises of a living forest. Eleanor leaned against me and whispered, "This is what I needed." I believed her. I wanted to believe it for myself too. As evening fell, we lit a small fire. The flames cracked in the growing dark. We cooked a simple dinner and ate with the satisfaction of people who had nothing to rush toward. Afterward, Eleanor read by flashlight, while I leaned back against my pack, tracing the outline of stars through the breaks in the canopy. I do not know the precise moment when the feeling shifted, only that it did. One moment the night was ordinary, the next it pressed in heavier, as though the silence itself was waiting. The cicadas stopped. The creek seemed louder because everything else had gone still. Eleanor noticed too. She lowered her book and frowned. "Where did they all go?" she asked. I had no answer. I told myself it was natural. Sometimes the woods fall quiet without reason. Predators moving through or shifts in temperature. But the quiet lingered. We both strained to hear something, anything. A branch cracked deeper in the trees, deliberate and slow. Eleanor's hand found mine. "Dear," I whispered, though I did not believe it. The sound came again, closer, another branch breaking under weight. Whatever moved out there was heavy. The fire popped, startling us both. Eleanor exhaled nervously and forced a laugh. "You're right. Probably just a deer." She tried to return to her book, but I could see her eyes flickering to the dark. Eventually the cicadas returned, tentatively at first and then in full chorus. The normal rhythm of the forest resumed as if nothing had interrupted it. I told myself to relax, but the tension had lodged itself inside me. Later, when we climbed into the tent, I lay awake listening. Eleanor fell asleep quickly, her breathing even and soft. For me, sleep came in fragments, broken by small sounds outside. I could not shake the sense that something had watched us earlier. I convinced myself it was imagination, born from too much quiet. I must have dozed because when I next opened my eyes, it was deep night. The tent glowed faintly from the embers outside. That was when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps circling. Not the scatter of small animals, not the cautious tread of a deer. These were measured steps, slow, pacing around us. I froze listening. The hair on my arms lifted. The steps paused, then resumed, moving from one side of the tent to the other. I reached for the pocket knife I kept by my sleeping bag. Eleanor stirred slightly but did not wake. I debated whether to shake her, but fear of panicking her kept me still. The footsteps stopped near the back of the tent. Silence stretched. My heart hammered. After a minute that felt endless, the steps retreated, fading into the woods until there was only the creek again. I did not sleep after that. I waited, every muscle tense, until the first light of dawn filtered through the nylon walls. Eleanor woke cheerful, unaware of what I had heard. I almost convinced myself not to tell her, but the weight of it pressed until I did. She frowned, skeptical but not dismissive. "Maybe it was an animal," she suggested. "Maybe," I replied, but we both knew animals do not walk in circles with such deliberate rhythm. We spent the morning hiking along the creek. Sunlight filtered through leaves, and the forest seemed harmless again. Eleanor tried to keep the mood light, pointing out wildflowers and teasing me for my serious face. I wanted to let her pull me back into ease, but every broken branch made me glance twice. Every shadow seemed heavier. At one point we came across old boot prints in the mud near the creek. They were deep, larger than my own, and heading toward our camp. Eleanor crouched to study them. "Hunters," she guessed. I nodded, though I had never known hunters to wander this far-off trail without packs or gear. The prints stopped at the clearing's edge, as though whoever left them had walked straight into the place we slept. That night, unease returned sharper. We ate quietly, listening for sounds beyond the fire. The woods obliged us with occasional rustles, but nothing like the footsteps. Eleanor tried to reassure me. "If someone's out there, they probably just passed through. No reason to linger." I nodded, but doubt filled me. The boot prints had not continued past our clearing. Whoever it was had stopped here. And as I crawled into the tent again, knife within reach, I could not shake the thought that something had chosen to stop exactly where we were, and that perhaps it had not left at all. That second night in the woods carved itself into my memory more sharply than any other. We had banked the fire lower, the orange light barely enough to push back the dark. Eleanor nestled into her sleeping bag and drifted off quickly, but my body refused rest. Every shift of the wind felt like a presence. The canvas of the tent whispered against itself, and the creek outside seemed louder than before, like it was rushing to cover other noises. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again, the footsteps. They came faintly at first, as though circling from a distance. The pattern was unmistakable, steady and deliberate. My pulse quickened. I gripped the knife in my hand and held my breath, hoping Eleanor would stay asleep. The steps crept closer, crunching on leaves, pausing, then moving again. What made it worse was the sense of mimicry. Each time I shifted slightly on my mat, the sound outside followed with a half-second delay, as though whoever was out there wanted me to know they were copying me. When I drew a slow breath, I swore I could hear a faint echo of it outside, raspy and too precise to be an accident. I sat up, heart pounding, and whispered, "Hello." The word came out dry, catching in my throat. The footsteps stopped immediately. The silence afterward was unbearable, stretched tight like a wire ready to snap. Then, from just beyond the tent wall, I heard a sound that should not have been possible. My own voice answering back. "Hello," it repeated, the tone wrong, strained, as though my throat had been dragged across gravel. I froze, every muscle clamped in terror. Eleanor stirred beside me, mumbling something in her sleep, and the thing outside shifted again, almost curiously, as if reacting to her. I snapped out of paralysis and shook her gently. "Elle, wake up." She blinked, disoriented, then sat up when she saw my expression. "What is it?" she whispered. Before I could answer, the voice came again, this time closer, right at the thin wall of nylon. "Hello." Eleanor's face drained of color. She clutched my arm and whispered, "That's you." "No," I said. "It isn't." We sat there silent, listening. Whatever it was had grown still too, waiting. After long minutes, the sound of slow retreating steps began, measured and unhurried. until they melted into the forest. Eleanor gripped my hand so tightly it hurt. "Daniel, we have to leave in the morning," she said, her voice shaking. I wanted to agree immediately, but pride and fear tangled in me. Leaving meant hiking back in the dark with no clear trail, risking getting lost. Part of me still wanted to explain it away, to believe it was someone playing a cruel trick, but there were no other campers for miles. I had chosen this place for its isolation. Who would come this far just to torment us? We didn't sleep again that night. Eleanor insisted we pack. The air was cold, our movements sluggish from exhaustion. I tried to keep calm for her sake, but every snapped twig made me flinch. We folded the tent quickly, doused the fire, and strapped everything into our packs. Just as we were about to leave, I noticed something in the dirt by where the fire had been. Prints. Not just the boot prints from before, newer ones, deeper, circling our camp in a wide ring. But there was something wrong with them. The tread pattern was identical to mine. Every detail, down to the worn edge of my heel, but they were larger, stretched as if someone had taken my footprint and pulled it into a distorted version. Eleanor saw them too. She stared for a long time, then whispered, "It's copying you." I couldn't answer. My stomach twisted. I wanted to deny it, but the evidence was right there in the soil. We left quickly, following the faint game trail back toward the service road. The forest felt hostile now. The trees seemed taller, pressing together. The light dimmer than it should have been for mid-morning. Eleanor kept glancing behind us, her face pale, her lips tight. After about an hour, the trail disappeared. I stopped, scanning for landmarks. I was certain we had been heading the right direction, but the creek we should have paralleled was nowhere to be heard. The undergrowth thickened, and the path seemed to curve back on itself. Eleanor noticed too. "Daniel, we've been here already." She pointed to a fallen birch with its bark peeling in strips. I recognized it. We had passed it less than half an hour earlier. Somehow we had looped back. My throat went dry. I pulled out the compass I always carried. The needle spun uselessly, twitching back and forth as though caught in a magnet. Eleanor whispered, "We can't be stuck here." I tried to steady my voice. "We'll keep moving. Just one direction until we hit the road. It has to be out there." So we walked. I chose a bearing and forced us to stick to it. The forest grew quieter as the hours passed, the usual sounds thinning until only our breathing and the crunch of our boots remained. And then even that didn't feel like ours anymore. Somewhere behind us, footsteps fell in sync with our own. At first I thought it was an echo, but the rhythm was wrong. When I quickened my pace, the sound lagged, then caught up. When I slowed, it overshot me, then corrected. Eleanor noticed too. She turned sharply, eyes wide. "There's nothing there," she said, though her voice trembled. But the sound persisted, dogging us, always just out of sight. By late afternoon, our nerves were frayed. We hadn't found the road, and the forest felt endless. We stopped to drink water, trying to rest. That was when Eleanor gasped and pointed at the trees. Carved into the bark of an oak were letters. My name, Daniel. The letters were deep, fresh, as though gouged only moments earlier. My skin prickled. Eleanor grabbed my sleeve. We ran, abandoning the idea of direction, just pushing forward, desperate to put distance between ourselves and that tree. Branches tore at our clothes. Thorns scratched our arms. The sound of footsteps followed, keeping pace effortlessly no matter how fast we moved. Finally, we stumbled into another clearing. My legs ached, lungs burning. Eleanor collapsed onto a fallen log, crying quietly. I scanned the area, desperate for any sign of the road. Instead, I found something worse. In the dirt at the edge of the clearing stood a rough circle of stones. Not random, but arranged deliberately, stacked in pairs. At the center lay an object that made my stomach clench. Our blanket, the one Eleanor had insisted we bring, folded neatly as if placed there on display. Eleanor covered her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. How did it get that? I had no answer. The blanket had been packed deep in her bag, zipped and clipped shut. Yet here it was, cleaned it. Impossible. We didn't move for a long moment. The woods around us seemed to lean closer, watching. Finally, Eleanor whispered, "It doesn't want us here. It's showing us." I wanted to argue, to deny, but I couldn't. Every sign pointed to something deliberate, intelligent, and malicious. We were not lost by accident. We were being kept. Night fell faster than it should have. The shadows swallowed the clearing before we could decide what to do. We were too exhausted to keep running, but too terrified to stay where we were. In the end, fear of stumbling blindly through the woods in the dark forced us to set the tent again, hearts racing with every snap of a twig. Inside, Eleanor clung to me, trembling. "If we make it out," she whispered, "we can never tell anyone. They wouldn't believe us." I stroked her hair, though my hands shook. "We'll make it out," I said, though the words felt hollow. Outside, the woods grew silent again. And then, just as sleep threatened to overtake us, the mimicry returned. This time, it was Eleanor's voice. From just beyond the tent wall, in a strained, broken echo, came the words, "We'll make it out." The sound of Eleanor's own voice, warped and leaking through the thin fabric of the tent, froze her in place. I felt her body stiffen against mine, her nails digging into my arm as if to anchor herself to something real. Neither of us spoke, terrified that any sound would invite another reply. The silence stretched so long I wondered if I had imagined it, but then it came again, slower this time, breaking across syllables like someone learning how to speak. "We'll make it out." Eleanor whimpered softly, muffled against my chest. My pulse thundered in my ears. I wanted to tell her it wasn't real, that maybe the forest was playing tricks, but the words died before they formed. I knew what I'd heard. The mimic circled us through the night. Sometimes it used my voice, sometimes hers, sometimes both in quick succession, weaving fragments of phrases we had said that day. The cadence was always slightly off, like a bad recording with the tape stretched. At one point, it repeated Eleanor's laugh from earlier, when she had joked about the GPS dying. Except it was lower, hollow, and without warmth. We did not sleep. We clutched each other until dawn finally bled gray through the fabric of the tent. When we unzipped it, there were no prints in the soil, no sign of anything at all, only the stillness of the clearing and the eerie neatness of our belongings. The blanket remained folded in the circle of stones, untouched. Eleanor refused to step near it. "It's bait," she whispered. I agreed. I didn't want to touch it either. We left it there, abandoning one of the few comforts we'd brought. Packs on our shoulders, we pushed out of the clearing, desperate for movement, for progress of any kind. The forest gave us nothing but repetition. Every direction led us back to the same landmarks, the fallen birch with its peeling bark, the carved oak with my name, now joined by another gouged word. Eleanor, etched crudely beneath mine. She stared at it with wide eyes, then turned to me. "Daniel, we're not lost. It's moving around us." Her words rang true. I couldn't admit it aloud, but deep inside I knew she was right. The forest wasn't simply confusing us, something was arranging it. By midday, hunger gnawed at us. We stopped to eat granola bars, though neither of us could stomach much. I kept scanning the trees, certain I'd catch sight of a figure, but the woods offered only absence. Still, the sense of being watched grew heavier. At one point, Eleanor gasped and pointed. She thought she saw someone behind a tree. When I ran toward it, the space was empty, only bark and moss untouched. We argued about what to do. Eleanor wanted to leave the packs behind and run until our legs gave out. I insisted we keep them. Food, water. Even a tent could mean survival. If we panic, we'll die faster, I told her. The words sounded cold even to me, but I couldn't let fear strip us of what little preparation we had. That night we built no fire. We didn't dare draw attention. We huddled in the tent, whispering in short bursts, trying to convince ourselves that morning would bring escape. But the mimic found us again. It began softly, my voice, calling Eleanor's name from somewhere deep in the woods. At first she thought it was me and answered weakly. When my actual voice contradicted hers, she realized the mistake, her face twisted in dread. The mimic called again, closer. Eleanor. It croaked, my own tone bent in half. She covered her ears. I held her tighter, wishing I could block out the sound myself. Then came her own voice from the other side of the tent, calm and measured. Daniel, it's over here. I shook my head violently. Don't listen. The mimic circled, weaving our voices together, sometimes speaking over itself, sometimes blending them into something guttural. The tent quivered as though something brushed against it. I drew the knife again, holding it in front of me like it could ward off whatever was out there. Then the zipper shifted. I saw it move, the small metal teeth pulling apart without a hand to guide them. Eleanor screamed and clutched me. I lunged forward, yanking the zipper back up and snapping the clasp into place. My hands shook violently. The mimic fell silent after that, as though disappointed. We didn't hear it again until dawn. When we finally emerged from the tent, something new waited for us. On the ground before the entrance lay a pair of boots. My boots. Except they weren't. The leather was stretched wrong, the soles warped, the laces frayed but tied into neat bows. They were larger, like the distorted footprints we had seen before, as though something had tried to replicate my belongings, but hadn't understood the shape. Eleanor backed away, her voice trembling. It wants to be you. I couldn't look at them for long. We left the clearing again, walking until our legs ached. This time, the forest didn't bother hiding its tricks. We came across another clearing by late afternoon, and at first it felt new, until we noticed the circle of stones again. At the center lay not the blanket this time, but Eleanor's book, propped open to the page she'd been reading our first night. She broke then. Tears streaked down her cheeks as she whispered, "It's inside our things. It knows what we touch, what we keep close." I couldn't comfort her. I couldn't comfort myself. Every sign pointed to one truth: we were not meant to leave. We forced ourselves onward, dragging through undergrowth until the sky dimmed again. That night, we didn't pitch the tent. We crouched beneath a fallen tree, praying that the mimic wouldn't find us. But of course it did. The footsteps began around midnight, circling our hiding place in a slow radius. Then came the voices, not just ours this time, but others, layers of speech we didn't recognize, rasping fragments in tones that didn't belong to human throats. They overlapped, whispered, laughed, cried. At one point, a child's voice sang a broken tune before cutting off into silence. Eleanor pressed her hands over her ears and sobbed. I held her and whispered, "It can't touch us, it's just noise." But even as I said it, I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a tall shadow gliding between trees, too thin, too long-limbed, slipping away before I could track it. The mimic was no longer content with sound. It wanted to be seen. By dawn, our bodies were wrecked. We stumbled on autopilot, driven only by fear and desperation. When the trees finally thinned and sunlight broke open into another clearing, I almost wept with relief until I realized what stood in the middle. Our tent, set up perfectly, sleeping bags inside, the stove beside it, the blanket draped neatly across the entrance. Everything arranged as though we had never left. Eleanor stopped dead. "No," she whispered. "No, we tore it down. We left it." But there it was, waiting. We stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, staring at the tent as though it had grown out of the ground overnight. The fabric rippled slightly in the morning breeze, harmless in appearance, ordinary even. But we knew better. Eleanor shook her head violently, whispering, "Don't go near it. Daniel, don't." Her fear was contagious. I didn't want to step closer either. The sight of our belongings, set up so neatly after we had carried them miles away, made my skin crawl. It wasn't just mimicry now. It was possession. Whatever we had stumbled into was rearranging the world around us, laying out familiar things like bait, like traps. Maybe. I started, then stopped. I couldn't even form an excuse. There was no maybe. We hadn't done this. Eleanor tugged my arm. "We keep moving. Pretend it isn't there." So we did. We turned our backs on the tent and walked deeper into the trees, though every step felt like walking away from ourselves. My pack seemed heavier than before. Eleanor trailed behind, her breath shallow, eyes darting toward every shadow. We didn't speak much. There was nothing left to say that didn't sound like panic. By midday, we were utterly lost. The landmarks had twisted again. The carved oak was back, our names gouged deeper. The edges darkened as though they had been burned. Underneath, a new word waited. "Sta." Eleanor broke down when she saw it. "It's telling us we can't leave," she said, sinking to her knees. Her voice cracked with exhaustion. "Daniel, what if this forest doesn't end? What if it's just circles forever?" I knelt beside her, trying to keep my voice steady. "It ends. It has to. We'll find the road. We just have to keep walking." But even as I said it, I felt the hollowness in my chest. We kept moving, driven by stubbornness more than hope. Hours later, we stumbled into another clearing. My heart sank before I even registered what I was looking at. The tent again. This time, it wasn't empty. Shapes moved inside. At first, I thought it was the wind tugging at fabric, but then a silhouette leaned against the wall from within. Tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, head cocked at an angle that defied human posture. Eleanor gasped and stumbled backward. The shape pressed closer, dragging fingers down the nylon. The sound was like claws scratching glass. Then it spoke, the voice muffled by fabric but unmistakable. "Come in." The words were in my tone, low and deliberate. Eleanor clutched my arm so tightly it hurt. "We're leaving. Right now." We ran. Branches whipped at our faces, roots tried to snare our boots. But adrenaline pushed us forward. Behind us, I swore I could hear the tent zipper tearing open, though I didn't dare look back. We ran until the forest blurred, until our lungs burned and our legs gave out. Finally, we collapsed near a cluster of boulders, panting, trembling. Eleanor clung to me, her face wet with tears. "We're never getting out," she whispered. I wanted to argue, but I was too tired, too scared. That night, we didn't even try to rest. We huddled against the rocks, listening. The forest had gone quiet again, suffocating in its stillness. Then the mimic returned, but this time it didn't circle us. It came in close. First, Eleanor's voice, whispering my name from behind the rocks. Then mine, calling hers from the opposite direction. The voices grew louder, overlapping, urgent. "Daniel, Eleanor," over and over from every side, closing in. I covered my ears, but the sound vibrated inside my skull. Eleanor sobbed openly, begging it to stop. Then the voices shifted. They began speaking in unison, repeating a single phrase in our tones, distorted and cracked. "You belong here." I couldn't take it. I stood, knife in hand, and shouted into the darkness, "Leave us alone." For a moment, silence. Then the forest erupted in laughter, our laughter, twisted and hollow, echoing from every tree. Eleanor collapsed, curling into herself, muttering, "Make it stop, make it stop." I pulled her close, shielding her as best I could, though I knew it was useless. The mimic had us caged, and the forest was its walls. By dawn, the laughter faded. We were left hollow, drained, too weak to keep moving. But hunger forced us onward. We ate the last of our food and drank from the creek we stumbled across, though the water tasted metallic wrong. Eleanor gagged after swallowing, insisting it felt thick, but we had no choice. Later that day, the forest offered us something new: a path. A narrow trail wound through the undergrowth, faint but visible. It looked human-made. Eleanor's eyes lit with a flicker of hope. Daniel, it could lead out. I hesitated. Every instinct told me it was another trick. But we had no strength left for endless wandering, so we followed it. The path twisted between trees, narrowing until we had to walk single file. The air grew colder, the canopy darker. After what felt like an hour, the trail widened into another clearing. I stopped dead. In the center stood two figures. At first glance, they looked like us, me and Eleanor, standing side by side. But their proportions were wrong. Their limbs stretched too long, their faces blurred as though half formed from shadow and clay. They wore our clothes, or something close to them, fabric stretched and sagging, colors slightly off. The mimicry had taken shape. Eleanor screamed, stumbling backward. The figures tilted their heads in unison, jerky and unnatural, before taking a step toward us. Their movements were delayed, like watching a reflection in warped glass. When they opened their mouths, our voices spilled out in broken chorus. "Don't leave." We ran again, blind with terror, crashing through undergrowth until our bodies ached. Behind us, I heard the sound of pursuit. Steps too long, too heavy, crashing against the earth. But when we finally stopped to breathe, nothing followed. The forest was empty once more. We collapsed in exhaustion, shaking, whispering prayers we hadn't spoken in years. Eleanor's face was pale, her lips cracked. "Daniel," she whispered, "if we don't make it out, promise you'll remember me." I kissed her forehead, choking back tears. We're getting out. Both of us. But the promise felt fragile, like the forest could snap it apart at any moment. That night, we didn't even attempt shelter. We lay against each other beneath the open sky, praying that dawn might bring salvation. Instead, the forest brought something else. When the voices returned, they weren't outside. They were inside our heads. Eleanor gasped, clutching her temples, crying out as if her skull was splitting. I felt it too, a vibration, a pressure, a voice that wasn't sound but thought. It repeated the same phrase again and again, in both of our voices. "You belong here." The intrusion into our minds was worse than any sound outside the tent. At least when it circled us in the dark, we could pretend barriers existed, that fabric and firelight meant something. But this voice bypassed all defenses. It bloomed inside my skull, crowding out my own thoughts until it was hard to tell which ones belonged to me. "You belong here." The phrase repeated endlessly, sometimes in my voice, sometimes in Eleanor's, sometimes in a broken union of both. It wasn't sound, not exactly. It pulsed through my head like static, like someone tapping directly against my brain. Eleanor writhed beside me, pressing her hands to her temples, whispering, "Stop, stop, stop," as though words could banish it. I wanted to comfort her, but the pressure was overwhelming. My vision blurred, trees swaying and bending, as though the forest itself moved in rhythm with the words. I thought of the carved oak, of the boots that weren't mine, of the tent reappearing again and again. All of it had been leading here, to this violation of the last thing we thought untouchable. At some point, the repetition fractured. The phrase broke into new words, tangled, clumsy but carrying intent. Stay. Not yours, ours now." The pressure eased only when Eleanor screamed. The forest seemed to pause, listening, savoring her terror. Then the silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Eleanor collapsed into my arms, shaking violently, her eyes wide and unfocused. We stayed like that until dawn, neither of us sleeping. By morning, Eleanor's voice was hoarse, her body limp with exhaustion. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. I brushed hair from her face, though my own hands trembled. "We'll find the road. Today, no matter what." But the forest wasn't done with us. We set off, dragging ourselves through undergrowth, determined to keep moving in one direction. Hours passed, the sun shifting overhead, but no road appeared. Only more trees, more silence. Hunger gnawed at us. Thirst burned our throats. The water from the creek had made Eleanor ill, her stomach twisting painfully. She doubled over at one point, dry, hiving into the leaves. While she crouched there, I looked around desperately for landmarks. That was when I saw it again. The tent. This time it wasn't in a clearing. It stood crooked between trees, jammed against a slope, as if it had forced itself into a place it didn't belong. The fabric sagged, seams stretched unnaturally. The sight of it made bile rise in my throat. Eleanor followed my gaze, then shook her head violently. "No, I won't look at it again." We turned away, forcing ourselves to walk in the opposite direction. But 20 minutes later it was there again, set neatly this time as though mocking us. Inside, shadows shifted. Eleanor's strength broke. She sank to the ground, sobbing openly. "It won't let us leave," she whispered. "Daniel, it's already decided." I knelt, gripping her shoulders. "Don't say that. If it wanted us dead, it could have killed us already. It wants something else." "But what?" The question gnawed at me. Did it want us to surrender, to stay willingly, or was it playing with us, stretching our terror like a child stretching a bug's wings before the kill? That night, we tried to keep walking, refusing to stop. But exhaustion claimed us. Around midnight, Eleanor stumbled and fell, too weak to rise. I lowered her to the ground, pulling her close, whispering promises I couldn't believe. The forest around us was alive with sound again. Not cicadas, not owls, but whispers. Countless voices layered over one another, speaking fragments of language, some ours, some alien. When the mimic returned, it didn't bother with distance. A figure stepped into view. At first, I thought it was me again, the same warped reflection we had seen before. But as it drew closer, I saw it was Eleanor. Or rather, a version of her. Taller, stretched, face blurred at the edges, but undeniably her. Her hair, her stance, her clothes reproduced in uncanny imitation. The sight shattered Eleanor. She screamed, covering her face, begging it not to come closer. The mimic tilted its head, jerky and wrong, then echoed her scream in perfect pitch, dragging it out until the trees themselves seemed to vibrate with the sound. I staggered to my feet, knife raised, though I knew it was useless. "Get away from her." I shot it. The mimic stilled. Then, in my voice, it said, "Get away from her." Eleanor sobbed harder, curling into herself. I stepped between them, trembling. The mimic didn't move forward, but it didn't retreat either. It simply stood there, head cocked, watching. Then, slowly, it raised one arm and pointed deeper into the forest. "Come," it rasped, both in my tone and Eleanor's. I shook my head, my throat dry. "We're not going anywhere with you." The mimic lowered its arm. Then it smiled, or at least stretched its face into something that suggested a smile, though no human expression had ever looked like that. Without another sound, it melted back into the trees. We didn't follow. We couldn't. We clung to each other through the night, praying it wouldn't return. But the forest remained restless, alive with whispers and shifting shadows. By dawn, Eleanor was feverish. Her skin burned hot, her eyes glazed. She muttered incoherent words, fragments of the mimic's phrases. "Stay belong ours." I tried to soothe her, but fear coiled in my gut. It wasn't just copying us anymore. It was infecting us. I carried her as best I could, stumbling through the forest with her weight on my back. My body screamed with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. I told myself that if I just kept moving, I would find the road, or another person, or any sign of escape. But the forest gave me nothing, only trees, endless and identical. By midday, I collapsed beneath her weight. We lay together on the forest floor, Eleanor's breath shallow, her skin clammy now instead of hot. She gripped my hand weakly and whispered, "Daniel, I think it already has me." I shook my head, tears burning my eyes. "No, don't say that. You're stronger than this." But even as I said it, I heard movement behind us. When I turned, my blood turned to ice. Another Eleanor stood there. Not blurred this time, not stretched. Perfect, every detail correct, her face, her hair, her trembling hands. She looked down at us with a calm expression, then spoke in Eleanor's voice. "Daniel, come with me. She can't go any farther." I looked from the mimic to the real Eleanor, weak and pale in my arms. My chest ached, my mind splitting. The mimic's tone was perfect, flawless. For a moment, I couldn't tell which voice was hers and which was not. Eleanor squeezed my hand faintly, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Don't believe it." The mimic smiled softly, tilting its head just like Eleanor always did when she teased me. "You'll die out here," it said. "With me. You'll live. Belong." I tightened my grip on the knife, though it felt pathetic in my hand. The forest went utterly still, waiting for my choice. The clearing was a stage, and I was caught between two versions of the woman I loved. Eleanor lay limp in my arms, feverish and fading, while the other stood upright and unbroken, eyes clear, body steady. The mimic smiled gently, reassuringly, as though it had studied every nuance of her kindness. "Daniel," it said in her voice, "you don't have to suffer anymore." The real Eleanor tried to lift her head, her lips barely moving. "Don't believe?" Her voice was weak, rasping, the words almost swallowed by the forest. I looked back at the mimic. It tilted its head, copying the real Eleanor's mannerisms perfectly, almost mockingly. "She wants you to die out here," it said. "I want you to live with me. You belong here." The words struck deeper than I wanted to admit. Belong? My mind was rag, my body failing, and part of me wanted to collapse into the offer, to surrender, to let someone else decide for me. But then Eleanor coughed weakly, her grip tightening on my hand with what little strength she had left. The faint squeeze was enough. It was imperfect, fragile, and human. The mimic's perfection suddenly felt like a mask stretched too tight. "No," I whispered. "You're not hurt." The mimic's smile wavered, then widened grotesquely. Its skin rippled, face blurring for a moment before reforming. The forest seemed to sigh around us, the trees creaking as though disappointed. "You will stay," it said, voice shifting from Eleanor's to mine, to something deeper layered. One way or another. It stepped closer. I raised the knife, trembling but determined. "Stay back." The mimic paused, tilting its head again. Then, with startling speed, it turned and melted into the trees, gone in seconds as though it had never been there. The silence it left behind was worse than its presence. Eleanor moaned softly. I held her tighter, whispering promises I didn't believe. "We'll get out. I swear it." But the forest didn't let us rest. That night, we didn't dare close our eyes. Whispers crawled through the trees, words stitched together from our voices, repeating endlessly. Sometimes they begged, sometimes they commanded, sometimes they just laughed. My knife felt useless in my hand. Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering fragments of the same words the mimic had forced into our heads. By dawn, I knew we couldn't go on like this. If we stayed, we'd waste away, and the forest would have us entirely. I had one choice left: fire. I gathered fallen branches, stacking them high, Eleanor lay nearby, too weak to help, her eyes glassy. I sparked the flame with shaking hands, feeding it until it roared higher than any campfire we'd built before. Smoke rose into the canopy, curling upward, a signal or a challenge. The forest didn't like it. The whispers grew louder, angrier. The ground trembled faintly beneath us. Shadows flickered in the smoke, tall figures stretching and twisting, circling just beyond the light. Eleanor whimpered, clutching my sleeve, but I kept feeding the fire, daring the mimic to show itself. And it did. Shapes emerged from the tree line. Not one but many. Dozens of figures, all imperfect reflections of us, faces blurred, limbs too long, clothes hanging wrong. They surrounded the clearing, watching with empty patience. My stomach lurched, but I forced myself to stand tall, knife in one hand, fire at my back. "You can't have us," I shouted, my voice cracking. "We don't belong to you." The figures swayed in unison, their heads tilting. Then, as one, they spoke in a chorus of our voices. "You already do." The sound rattled through me, but I clung to the fire. It was the only thing that felt real. I kicked burning branches outward, scattering sparks toward them. The figures recoiled slightly, their forms flickering like smoke. The fire hurt them, or at least unsettled them. That was enough. I hoisted Eleanor onto my back again, ignoring the scream of my muscles, and stepped through the smoke. The figures parted reluctantly, hissing in voices not quite human. Some reached toward us, but shrank back from the flames. Step by step, we forced our way through. The forest twisted around us, trees rearranging, paths looping. But I didn't let us stop. I carried Eleanor until my body threatened to collapse. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, the ground changed. Gravel. I blinked in disbelief. A road. Cracked, but real. I stumbled onto it, nearly dropping Eleanor in my shock. Sunlight broke through the canopy, warmer than it had felt in days. For the first time, I heard something beyond the forest, the faint hum of an engine, distant but approaching. Eleanor stirred weakly. "Daniel, we made it," I whispered, tears spilling down my face. "We're out." Minutes later, a pickup truck rounded the bend, a hunter at the wheel. He slammed the brakes when he saw us, leaping out with wide eyes. "Jesus Christ, you folks all right?" I collapsed to my knees, still clutching Eleanor. "Help her," I begged. "Please." He rushed to us, helping lift her into the truck. As we drove away, I looked back once, just once. The forest loomed behind us, still and silent. But along the edge of the trees, a dozen blurred figures stood watching, their heads tilted in unison. One of them lifted a hand and waved. Eleanor survived, though the fever lingered for weeks. Doctors said it was likely infection from bad water. They didn't believe me when I told them what we'd seen. I stopped trying to explain. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, the faint echo of my own voice whispering from the corners of the dark. "You belong here." I hold Eleanor close when it comes, praying that the forest is far behind us. But deep down I know the truth. We never really left. My name is Nathaniel Crowley, and I have maintained a remote cabin in the Rocky Mountains for the better part of 12 years. I am 46 years old, unmarried, and with few ties outside of the wilderness I now call home. My work began as seasonal upkeep for the Forest Service, repairing storm damage, clearing brush, and keeping the hiking paths accessible to the few who dared wander this deep into the range. Over time, the position became permanent, and the cabin that was once just a station turned into my home. The isolation suits me, yet it is not solitude alone that governs my existence here. There are rules, strange and specific, that must be followed if one intends to survive. I did not create them. They were passed to me by the last caretaker before he vanished without farewell. I follow them because I have seen what happens when even a single one is ignored. The cabin sits at the end of a narrow dirt road that climbs and winds for nearly an hour beyond the last ranger station. Past that point, the land is all steep switchbacks, dark pines and cliffs that look down into valleys too far below to name. No power lines run this high. My only light is the kerosene lanterns and the solar panels I installed myself years ago. The cabin itself is not much to look at. 2 rooms, a porch, and a shed out back. But appearances do not matter here. What matters are the boundaries, the rituals, and the respect for forces that most would dismiss as superstition. I can assure you, superstition does not tear bark from trees in clawed spirals or rearrange stones into circles during the night. The first time I came here, the man who trained me, Samuel Hale, was nearing 70. His beard was long and white, his hands knotted with age, but his eyes had a clarity that unnerved me. He showed me the rules not with humor or skepticism, but with grave insistence. He wrote them on a page that he folded into my hand, as if passing me contraband. "Read these tonight," he said. "Do not ignore a single one. If you do, the mountain will make you pay." I thought him eccentric, a hermit too long in the wild. But when I returned the following morning and told him I had read them, he only nodded with quiet relief. Less than a month later, he was gone. Some said he retired and left without telling anyone. Others whispered he was taken. All I know is that I woke one dawn to find the door to his cabin wide open, the bed neatly made, and his boots still resting by the hearth. No footprints trailed away in the fresh snow. No sign of a struggle, just absence. I was left to take his place. The rules are simple to write, harder to obey, and deadly when forgotten. I will not list them all at once, because they reveal themselves only in the flow of my daily life. But the first is this: never leave the cabin after midnight, no matter what you hear. The forest is full of voices after dark, and they are not meant for me. At times I have heard crying, like a child lost in the trees. At other times, I hear my own name spoken in a voice that imitates my father's. I have not seen my father in 20 years, yet the sound is perfect, down to the rasp in his throat. The temptation to step outside is strong, but the lock must stay bolted until the first pale light of morning touches the ridge. Samuel warned me that no one who opens the door at those hours survives till dawn. I have held to that rule with a faith stronger than religion. My days are less haunted, though never without unease. I rise early, splitting wood or repairing fences where the elk have trampled. Sometimes I hike the trails to clear fallen branches or check for washouts. It is honest work, grounding work, but I do not linger outside after dusk. The forest changes then. Its silence deepens, the birds retreat, and the wind no longer rustles in a natural pattern. It is as though the trees themselves listen. There is another rule: if you find stones stacked in spirals on the path, do not disturb them. Walk a wide circle around and keep moving. I once tested this, nudging one of the smaller stacks with my boot. By nightfall, I discovered the same spiral reconstructed inside my porch. Each stone balanced perfectly atop the next. I did not sleep that night. I have never tested that boundary again. Visitors are rare. Hikers occasionally stumble onto the cabin, tired or lost, and I offer water and directions. Some I warn gently not to camp near the valley below, or not to wander off trails when the mist thickens, but most laugh and dismiss my caution. I do not insist. To survive here, one must learn, and some lessons are cruel. Every year there are missing person reports in these mountains. I often wonder if the rules Samuel gave me are the only reason my name is not on one of those lists. I recall vividly one night in my 3rd year at the cabin. A storm had rolled in, sheets of rain hammering the roof, lightning flashing against the ridge. I was reading by lantern when I heard the knock. It was soft at first, then insistent. I froze. The rule about midnight is strict: never open the door, no matter who knocks, no matter how desperate the plea. The voice outside was a woman's, trembling, pleading for shelter. She said she was lost cold and would die if I did not let her in. Every instinct in me wanted to open the door. I could see her shadow pressed against the curtain, her outline shivering in the storm. But something was wrong. The lightning flashed, bright as day, and in that instant, the shadow did not vanish. It remained fixed against the window, blacker than the night itself. I gripped the lantern, sat in my chair, and prayed silently until dawn. When morning came, there were no footprints on the porch, just claw marks etched deep into the wood, 5 long gouges, as if something had dragged its hand across in rage. That section of the porch still bears the scars, and I leave them as warning to myself. Another rule: never answer when your name is called from the tree line. The voices are persistent. They know how to mimic, how to weave memories into sound. One evening, as the sun bled low, I heard my mother's voice calling me to supper, just as she had when I was a boy. She has been dead for decades. Still, the tone, the inflection, everything was exact. I gritted my teeth, kept splitting wood, and did not glance up. The voice called twice more, closer each time, before it dissolved into laughter that did not belong to any human throat. When I returned inside, I found a single plate set neatly on the table, steaming with stew. I had not cooked it. The smell was rich and tempting, but Samuel's notes were clear. Never eat food that appears unmade. I threw it into the fire. The stew hissed and writhed like living flesh until it blackened to ash. These rules do not feel like arbitrary superstitions. They are safeguards. The mountains harbor things older than our maps, hungrier than the predators we record. Sometimes, when the mist clings low across the valley, I catch glimpses between the trees, shapes too tall, too thin, moving with a gait that is both wrong and deliberate. I do not stare long. The rules advise if you see something that does not belong, pretend not to notice. Recognition invites approach. Indifference is protection. I think often of Samuel, of how he vanished. Did he break a rule? Did he finally grow wary of vigilance and let curiosity overtake him? The unanswered questions weigh heavier with each passing year. I keep his old rifle above the hearth, though bullets are useless against shadows. It is comfort, nothing more. The forest is not always hostile. Some days are serene, almost beautiful. The peaks glow gold with sunrise, and the streams run clear with snowmelt. Elk pass through the meadow, unbothered by my presence. In those moments, I almost forget the dread that hovers at the edges of night. But the balance is fragile. I know better than to believe peace means safety. The rules are reminders carved into the fabric of my days. They whisper of a cost that never stops waiting. That is the life I live in the Rockies, maintaining a cabin that is less a home than a fortress. The rules are chains, but they are also the reason I draw breath each morning. I write this account now not to seek pity, but to preserve the warning should I one day disappear as Samuel did. If you find this cabin, if you read these words, do not take them lightly. The mountain is patient. It waits for mistakes, and every mistake has a price. The days after the storm with the shadow at my window carried a weight that never quite lifted. I patched the porch, stacked my firewood, and went about the small routines that give life here structure. But I could feel a change. The mountain had pressed closer, as though it was testing me, measuring how far I would bend before I broke. The rules were not suggestions, they were demands, and each time I resisted the lure of a voice, the offering of food, or the whisper of curiosity, I wondered how long before the tests became something I could not endure. It was late September when the air turned sharp and the nights drew long. My supplies came up by mule every few months, dropped at the trailhead where I could haul them back with the old ATV. The delivery man, Joel, was the only regular face I saw. He had grown up near the base of the range and knew enough to respect the mountains. But he laughed when I told him about the rules. "You're worse than my granddad," he said once, hoisting a bag of flour from the truck bed. Old mountain men and their ghost stories. I didn't argue. Warnings seldom change the hearts of those who refuse to listen. Still, I made him swear never to walk up to the cabin after dark, no matter how late his deliveries ran. He agreed easily, but I noticed he avoided eye contact when he said it. People like Joel pretend to scoff, but something deep inside them believes, even if they won't admit it. That October, he was late. I waited until twilight before hiking down to the drop point myself, uneasy at the prospect of being caught in the open after sundown. The trail bent through switchbacks lined with pines, their needles rustling like whispers in the wind. By the time I reached the clearing, the last light was fading. The supplies were there, stacked neatly as always, but Joel was nowhere to be seen. His truck tracks cut into the dirt and vanished back down the road. I loaded what I could onto the ATV and hurried back, heart pounding with every crunch of gravel behind me. Twice I thought I heard footsteps matching mine, though when I stopped, the silence was total. By the time I reached the cabin, the moon was climbing and the rules were screaming in my memory: inside before dark, bolt the door, no exceptions. I just made it. That night, the voices returned. They circled the cabin like wolves, whispering, pleading, mocking. At one point I heard Joel's voice, frantic, crying for help. My hands twitched toward the lock before I caught myself. Joel had left hours earlier. Even if something had happened to him, it would not be him outside. The mimicry was too precise, too desperate. I shoved my hands under the blanket and forced myself to breathe through clenched teeth. By dawn, the voices were gone, but on the porch I found boot prints circling in the snow. They matched Joel's size and tread exactly. They stopped at the threshold of the door and did not return to the trail. A new rule emerged for me then, though Samuel had not written it down: do not assume the voices outside cannot learn from the people who visit. They study, they imitate, and they wait. I resolved to warn Joel directly the next time I saw him, but I never did. The following week, I learned through the ranger radio that he had gone missing while hunting with his cousins. They found his truck abandoned near a trailhead, the driver's side door open, keys still in the ignition. No tracks, nobody, just absence. My gut twisted with guilt, though I knew there was nothing I could have done. Still, it reminded me that the mountain is not merciful, and its hunger is not limited to the cabin's boundaries. Winter came heavy that year. Snow buried the cabin halfway to the windows, and nights stretched into frozen eternities. The rules took on new weight. One of them said, if you hear scratching on the roof, do not look up. It sounds simple enough until you live beneath a roof, where the snow muffles all sound except for that deliberate scrape. Claw against shingle, dragging slow and purposeful. The first time it happened, I nearly broke. The noise continued for hours, traveling from one end of the roof to the other, then back again, circling endlessly. I could not sleep, could barely breathe, and every part of me wanted to fling the door open and scan the roof with my lantern. But I stayed put, gripping Samuel's old rifle in my lap, eyes locked on the floorboards until the scratching finally ceased at dawn. When I ventured outside, the snow was untouched, the roof smooth. No tracks leading to it. But there was one undeniable detail: the shed door stood wide open. Inside, every tool I owned had been rearranged into a spiral on the floor, handles pointing inward, edges outward. The sight of it filled me with such revulsion that I staggered back, gagging on the cold air. I did not touch them. By nightfall, the tools were back in place, every one of them resting neatly on its shelf. I have not entered the shed after dark again. Another rule: never leave offerings. People sometimes ask if I ever tried to appease whatever dwells here by leaving food or gifts at the tree line. Samuel was clear on this point. Offerings are invitations. They show recognition, and recognition is surrender. The mountain takes without gratitude. It does not want worship, it wants weakness. I've seen the evidence myself. Years ago, a hiker wandered close, muttering prayers as he laid trinkets by the path. Coins, feathers, scraps of food. I watched from a distance, hidden behind the porch rail. He seemed calm, reverent even, whispering as if he were negotiating a truce. The following morning, I found his backpack propped against a stump near the clearing, neatly zipped. Inside were all his belongings, folded carefully. His boots sat beside it. He was never seen again. I burned the trinkets, every last one, and shoveled the ashes deep into the snow. The strangest rule, and perhaps the hardest to follow, is this: once a month, on the first night of the new moon, I must not sleep in the cabin at all. Instead, I am to take the lantern, step outside just after dusk, and sit on the porch until dawn, awake and silent. Samuel called it paying rent. I don't know if the cabin itself requires it, or if the mountain demands proof of vigilance, but I have never dared skip it. The first time I sat through that ritual, I felt exposed, every nerve aflame. The forest shifted around me, full of movement I could not see. Shapes drifted between the trees, silent and watchful. They never approached the porch, but they circled all night, flickers of impossible limbs gliding through the dark. My lantern guttered twice but never went out. When the horizon finally bled gray with dawn, the shapes melted away, leaving me shivering and hollow. The rent was paid, and each month since, I sit again, staring into the night, wondering if the day will come when the debt is called in full. By my fourth winter, the mountain had begun to feel less like a place and more like a presence. The rules were not static. They shifted, expanded, adapted. One morning I found new words scratched into the inside of the cabin door, jagged letters carved by no hand I recognized. They read, Dio no tichi, kles tio loenji. I traced the grooves with my finger, my stomach twisting. Samuel's handwriting had been neat and deliberate, but these letters were erratic, frantic. They looked burned into the wood more than cut. I considered sanding them down, but I left them. If the cabin itself offered warnings, I would not dismiss them. That evening, I understood. The trees outside seemed normal, ordinary pines swaying with the wind. But as I stared at them, I noticed their movements were not synced with the breeze. Some swayed against the gust, others bent when the air was still. And the longer I watched, the more I saw faces in the bark, pale impressions like masks stretched taut, mouths open in silent screams. My heart hammered. I yanked the curtain shut and forced myself to breathe. When I checked again at dawn, the trees stood still, ordinary as ever. But the memory of those faces has never faded. Since then, I glance only briefly at the tree line. The cabin's warning was true attention is invitation. There are nights when I think of leaving, packing what I can, hiking down the mountain, never looking back. But I know too much. The rules are not portable. They are bound to this place, to this cabin. If I abandon them, if I turn my back, I fear whatever stalks these woods would follow. Perhaps that is what happened to Samuel. Perhaps his mistake was not breaking a rule, but believing he could escape them. The snow is deep now, the air thin with ice. Each night is a test, and each morning is borrowed. I keep the lantern lit, the locks bolted, and my ears closed to the voices. I have survived so far, but survival here is not guaranteed. It is only ever rented, never owned. The third winter was the hardest, not only for the cold, but for the silence that seemed to grow thicker with every snowfall. Days would pass without the sound of a single bird. Even the creak of branches under snow felt muffled, as though the air itself were being smothered. I learned to dread that quiet more than any howl of wind, because the mountain only grew silent when it was listening. I would sit by the stove, staring at the door, lantern lit, waiting for the silence to break into something worse. The rules kept me alive, but they did not keep me sane. One night in January, I woke to the sound of my own voice. It was not a dream. From the porch came a steady murmur, low and rhythmic, like someone reading aloud. I strained my ears and realized it was speaking the rules, one by one, in my tone, with my cadence. Rule 1, it whispered. Do not leave the cabin after midnight, no matter what you hear. Then, softly, Rule 2, do not disturb the stone spirals. My skin crawled. The voice carried through the thin walls, word for word, the entire list I had memorized. Every rule, even the one Samuel had never written down, even the one about paying rent. My throat tightened, because I had never spoken that one aloud. Not once. When the voice reached the final warning, do not watch the trees too long, it went silent. For a long time I sat rigid in bed, waiting for the next breath, the next step. Nothing came. At dawn, when I dared open the door, there were no prints in the snow, only a perfect circle drawn with a fingertip around the porch, enclosing me like a trap. I erased it with my boot, but I could not erase the knowledge that whatever stalks the cabin knows every secret I hold. I thought of leaving again after that. I packed a rucksack, loaded it with jerky and coffee, maps and flares. But when I tried to step beyond the clearing, a pressure built in my chest, heavy and suffocating. The air thickened. The world spun, and I collapsed to my knees gasping. The moment I turned back toward the cabin, the pressure eased. I returned trembling, sweat freezing on my neck. I understood then that the rules did not merely keep me alive. They bound me here. This mountain does not release its debtors. Spring came late. The snow melted slow, revealing ground damp and swollen, trails broken by runoff. With thaw came other dangers. A new rule revealed itself in April: if you see an animal staring too long, do not acknowledge it. I learned this the hard way. A deer wandered into the clearing one morning, its hide patchy, ribs jutting. It stood motionless by the woodpile, staring at me with eyes too wide, too human. I waved my arms, shouted, tried to drive it off. It did not flinch. I grew uneasy and turned my back, resuming my chopping. When I glanced again, the deer was gone. Relief surged through me until I stepped inside and found it standing in the kitchen, silent, its head bent low beneath the ceiling beams. Its hooves left no prints on the floorboards, its eyes locked on mine, unblinking. The air stank of rot. I remembered the warning scrawled on the door and forced myself not to move. I sat in my chair, heart pounding, until night fell. When I dared look again, the deer was gone, though the boards still sagged where its hooves had pressed. That night I carved the new rule into the table with my nephew. Do not acknowledge what stares too long. By summer, I barely recognized myself. My beard had grown thick and streaked with gray, though I was not yet 50. My hands were calloused, cracked, my eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Yet I remained alive. Each sunrise was proof that vigilance mattered. Still, I wondered at what cost. The mountain did not want me strong. It wanted me worn thin, brittle. Samuel's notes had never spoken of escape, because perhaps there was none. Perhaps the cabin was not a refuge at all, but a lure, a trap to keep whatever dwells here tethered, needing a keeper, needing rent. And I was the current tenant. My lease renewed each dawn I obeyed. The strangest event of that year came in late July. I had been repairing the fence along the southern slope when I noticed movement in the tree line. A figure, tall and thin, standing between the pines. At first I thought it was a hiker, tall man, long coat, but then I saw that it had no face, only smooth, pale skin stretching unbroken where features should be. It did not move. It only watched. I froze, torn between running and pretending I had not seen. The rules echoed, if you see something that does not belong, pretend not to notice. My hands shook as I turned back to the fence, hammering nails that bent beneath my trembling grip. When I looked again, the figure was closer, standing at the edge of the clearing. My throat closed. I forced myself to keep working, though every nerve screamed to run. I hammered until my palms bled, never once meeting its gaze. By dusk it was gone, but when I returned to the cabin, the nails I had hammered were missing. Every single one. The fence stood bare, rails loose, as though I had done nothing all day. On the porch I found the nails arranged in another spiral, this one smaller, tighter, glinting with fresh blood not my own. That night I could not sleep. I sat by the window, lantern flickering, rifle heavy in my lap. The mountain was shifting again, testing me in new ways. The rules were evolving, or perhaps revealing layers Samuel had never lived long enough to discover. I thought of writing them down for whoever might come after me, but fear stopped my hand. The rules are not gifts, they are burdens. To write them is to pass them, and passing them is to admit I will not survive much longer. In August, a storm unlike any I had seen swept the ridge. Lightning struck so close the cabin shook. Rain fell in sheets thick enough to blur the trees. For 3 days it raged without pause. On the second night, the voices rose with the wind, shrill and overlapping, dozens at once. Some cried, some laughed, some begged. At the height of the storm, I heard Samuel's voice cut clear through them all. "Nathaniel, it's time to go." I pressed my hands to my ears, shaking, whispering the rules to myself like prayer. Stay inside. Bolt the door. Do not answer. The storm broke with dawn, but the voices lingered in my head, Samuel's above all. I fear he is not gone. I fear he is one of them now, repeating the lines he once gave me, drawing me toward the same end. September again. The leaves turned gold, the air crisp. With autumn came hunters, though they rarely wandered as far as my clearing. One morning, I found bright orange fabric tangled in the brush, part of a vest, shredded and stained. No tracks, no body. I burned it immediately. That evening, I heard gunshots echo in the valley, sharp cracks that should have faded, but instead drew closer, louder, until they seemed to ring just outside the cabin. I gripped my rifle, heart racing, and when the shots ceased, silence swallowed everything. I did not sleep that night. At dawn, I stepped onto the porch and found empty rifle casings, lined neatly along the railing, each stamped with a symbol I had never seen, twisted like antlers. The rules did not mention this, but I made one myself: never pick up what is left for you. I swept the casings into the fire and watched them curl into blackened ash. The smoke that rose from them stank like burning hair. The longer I stayed, the clearer it became that survival was not about strength or skill, but obedience. The rules were chains, and chains keep you alive at the cost of freedom. I remembered Samuel's hollow eyes, the way his voice had carried a weight beyond exhaustion. He had lived here decades. How many times had he sat through the rent nights, staring into the dark until dawn, never daring to blink too long? And when he vanished, was it because he broke a rule, or because he was finally collected? I cannot shake the thought that my own end will come the same way. Not with blood or struggle, but with absence. One morning, perhaps I will simply not be here. The cabin will stand empty, the bed neatly made, boots by the fire, and someone else will climb the ridge, wide-eyed, carrying a folded list of rules passed by trembling hands. Until then I remain. The cabin stands, the rules hold, and the mountain waits. Always it waits. October brought the first snow earlier than expected, a thin white sheet that blanketed the clearing and muffled every step I took. The cabin creaked under the weight of cold. The stove glowed with its familiar warmth, and yet I could not shake the sense that something was shifting again. The rules had kept me alive for years, but lately I felt as though the mountain itself was bending them, twisting them, looking for loopholes in its own design. I wondered if Samuel had felt this same erosion before his disappearance, as if the fortress of order he had clung to was slowly crumbling beneath him. It began with the mirror. I have only one, a cracked rectangle above the basin. I use it rarely, only when shaving. One evening as the light faded, I glanced at it and froze. The reflection was wrong. The cabin behind me appeared as it always did, lamplight flickering, stove fire low, but my own image was delayed. My mouth moved a fraction of a second too late. My hand raised after I had already lifted it. The delay was subtle at first, like a failing signal, but unmistakable. I slammed the mirror face down and covered it with a towel. A new rule etched itself in my mind: do not look into glass after sundown. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard faint scratching beneath the floorboards. Not mice. The sound was too deliberate, too steady, like fingernails dragging in long strokes. I clutched the rifle and waited. The scratching stopped at the first light of dawn. When I lifted the rug, the wood beneath was unmarked, but the air rising from the cracks carried the scent of damp earth and rot. I nailed the rug back down and whispered to myself that the rules are not written in stone but in survival. I added another: never lift what keeps the dark hidden. 2 weeks into the snow, a hiker stumbled into the clearing. His clothes were torn, his face pale with exhaustion. He introduced himself as Caleb, said he'd been lost for 2 days, separated from his group during a sudden whiteout. He asked if I had a radio, if I could help him find his way back. I hesitated. No one had come to the cabin in months, not since Joel disappeared. My instincts told me to refuse, to send him down the trail before dusk, but compassion tugged at me. I gave him water, a blanket, and let him warm by the stove. His hands trembled as he drank, his eyes darting to the door again and again, as though afraid of what followed. When I asked what happened, he shook his head. It wasn't the storm, he whispered. It was them. His eyes brimmed with tears. Tall things in the trees. I thought they were dead pines until they moved. I thought I heard my friends calling, but when I followed the voices, the ground. He stopped, clutching his hands together. I didn't press. I knew the tone of someone who had brushed against the rules without knowing them. Caleb begged to stay the night. The rules screamed in my head. Never share the cabin after sundown. Samuel had never written it down, but I remembered his warning in person, spoken only once. This place is meant for one. More than that. And the balance tips. I had never tested it. Yet when Caleb pleaded, his voice breaking, I couldn't bring myself to force him into the snow. Against my better judgment, I let him curl on the floor beside the stove. I lay awake, lantern lit, every muscle tight with dread. At midnight the voices came. They called Caleb's name, soft at first, then louder. He stirred, sat up, blinking, whispering that he heard his friends. I hissed at him to stay still, but he rose, shuffling toward the door. The lock rattled in its frame. I lunged, grabbing his arm. His eyes were blank, pupils blown wide, his lips moving soundlessly as though echoing something I could not hear. He fought with sudden strength, clawing at the bolt. I wrestled him to the floor, pinning him as the voices grew frenzied outside. They laughed, they wept, they begged. The door shook with pounding. Caleb screamed, not at me, but at the voices beyond the walls. "I'm here! I'm here!" I clamped my hand over his mouth until he went limp with exhaustion. The noise outside ceased at dawn. When I lifted myself off him, Caleb was cold. His eyes stared wide, mouth frozen mid-scream, though he had not made a sound in hours. I dragged him outside, weeping bitterly, and laid him in the snow. By evening, his body was gone. No prints led away. Only a spiral of melted ice where he had lain. For days after, the rules seemed to shift again, growing crueler. I no longer heard just voices. I saw shapes pressing against the window glass, faces I knew. My mother, my brother Joel. They mouthed words I could not hear, their eyes filled with sorrow. Each time I resisted, the shapes grew clearer, more insistent. I boarded the windows with planks, nailed tight, leaving only slivers for light. Still, at night I felt their gazes burning through. The rent night of that month nearly broke me. I sat on the porch as required, lantern at my feet, and the forest came alive. Not just flickers or shadows. This time they stepped clear into the clearing. Figures tall as trees, limbs jointed wrong, heads bent low as though they bore invisible burdens. They circled me slowly, never crossing the line of the porch. Their skin shimmered pale in the lantern glow, and their eyes glinted with a hunger I cannot describe. One paused directly in front of me, leaning closer, so close I could smell the damp rot on its breath. My chest seized. I clenched my jaw, refusing to move, refusing to acknowledge. For hours they lingered, a shifting ring of silent predators. When dawn finally bled over the ridge, they vanished like mist, leaving only deep gouges carved into the snow where their feet had pressed. I nearly collapsed with relief, but that morning I discovered a new horror. Inside the cabin, every rule I had ever written, every carving and note, was gone. The scratches on the table, the words on the door, even Samuel's folded paper, all erased as if they had never existed. Panic swallowed me. I tore through drawers, overturned the bed, searched every board. Nothing remained. It was as though the mountain was stripping me of memory, piece by piece. Only the rules in my head endured, fragile and fallible. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rewrite them, but each attempt vanished by morning. Ink blood into nothing, carvings smoothed overnight. Even when I burned the words into wood, the scars healed clean. The cabin itself would no longer allow the rules to be preserved. It was as though the mountain was confident I no longer needed reminders, that I was fully bound. The pressure grew daily. My dreams turned fevered, filled with images of spirals tightening, trees leaning closer, shadows sitting at the edge of my bed. I began to hear Samuel's voice constantly, whispering over my shoulder, correcting me, warning me. "You forgot one," he would murmur. "Don't you remember?" I would wake gasping, unable to tell if it was dream or truth. Late November, another storm struck. Snow hammered the cabin for 3 straight days, winds shrieking like laughter. On the second night, the door rattled violently. I pressed my weight against it, bolt straining. From outside came a chorus of voices chanting my name. Over and over, faster, louder, until it became one deafening roar. My ears bled with the force of it. I screamed back that I would not open it, never, and suddenly silence fell. Not just outside, inside too. The stove hissed out, the lantern flickered dark, and I was left in a void so absolute I thought I had gone deaf. Then came the knock, one slow, deliberate. The sound reverberated through the bones of the cabin. A second knock followed, then a third. No voice this time, no plea, just patient knocking, steady as a clock. It went on until the first light of dawn touched the window. When I dared look, the door was untouched. But beside the threshold, etched deep into the wood, was a new line, RNTSDUE. That was when I knew the balance was changing. The rules were no longer just to keep me alive. They were binding me to something larger, some contract I never agreed to but am forced to uphold. Rent is not just vigilance. Rent is flesh or blood or souls like Caleb's. I fear the day will come when my survival will require payment greater than endurance. The snow deepens daily. I wake each morning to silence, dread pressing on me like the weight of the peaks themselves. My body grows weaker, my beard whiter, my mind frayed by sleepless nights. I cling to the rules in my memory, chanting them like prayers. Yet I cannot help but wonder how long until the mountain demands a payment I cannot give. December is when the mountain becomes unbearable. The snow packs so deep that sound dies before it travels. The cold eats through every seam of clothing, every chink in the walls. I used to think isolation was the hardest part. Now I know it is endurance. The relentless weight of keeping to the rules when exhaustion makes you want to slip just once, just enough to rest. But rest is death here, and I am not ready to give the mountain that satisfaction. The new carving on my door, Dewey, haunted me. I couldn't stop staring at it, as though the words glowed with their own frost-bitten light. Samuel had never mentioned this rule. Either he had never reached this point, or he had paid in silence, never daring to write it down. The thought chilled me more than the snow. For weeks I waited for the mountain to collect. Nothing came at first. The silence stretched, until I almost convinced myself the carving had been a bluff, a test of my nerves. I should have known better. The mountain does not bluff. It began with dreams, not my own, but others. I would lie down, close my eyes, and wake inside lives that weren't mine. A woman tending a fire in a cabin I'd never seen. A boy wandering a field of snow, barefoot, his toes blackened with frost. A hunter kneeling beside a gutted deer, his hands slick with blood. Each dream ended the same way, with the figure looking up, directly at me, eyes wide, mouths whispering my name. I would jolt awake in my own bed, sweat freezing on my skin, their voices still echoing in my skull. The rules had never mentioned dreams. How do you resist something when sleep itself becomes the trap? I tried to stay awake, lantern burning, rifle in my lap, but no one can stay awake forever. The mountain knows this. Exhaustion is its sharpest blade. On the rent night of the new moon, I braced myself for the usual vigil on the porch. I wrapped in blankets, set the lantern at my feet, and waited. The forest stirred almost immediately. Figures moved between the trees, but this time they did not circle. They stood in rows, silent, facing me, a congregation of shadows. My chest locked tight as one of them stepped forward. It was Caleb. His eyes were black, his mouth slack, his skin pale as ice. He raised a trembling hand and pointed at me. Behind him, more shapes leaned forward. Joel, Samuel, even faces from my dreams. A crowd of the mountain's debtors, gathering, reminding me of the rent. I whispered the rules under my breath, gripping the rifle until my knuckles split. The figures did not cross the porch line, but they didn't need to. They stood until dawn, until my vision blurred and my mind frayed. When the first light bled over the ridge, they vanished, leaving the clearing scarred with hundreds of overlapping spirals. Rent had not been paid. Rent had only been deferred. The next day, I found a dead rabbit on the porch, throat slit clean. Its blood had been used to scrawl a symbol I had never seen, 3 jagged lines intersecting in a crude spiral. The message was clear enough: payment must be blood. I buried the rabbit deep in the snow, whispering apologies, but I knew it wasn't enough. The mountain does not accept what it gives. It only takes what belongs to you. That night, the scratching under the floorboards returned, louder than ever. The rug shifted, nails groaning as though something below was forcing its way up. I pressed the stove poker against the boards, whispering frantic prayers. The scratching stopped suddenly, replaced by a knock from beneath, 3 times, patient and steady. My breath caught. Rent is due. Always 3 knocks, always waiting. By the 3rd week of December, I had stopped eating properly. My stomach turned at the thought of food, and every time I lifted a spoon, I felt eyes watching from the walls. One evening, stew appeared again on the table, steaming, rich, tempting. I hadn't cooked it. I stared at it for hours, fighting the hunger clawing at my ribs. The rules are clear. Never eat what appears unmade. At last I hurled the pot into the fire. It hissed, flesh-like, writhing until it collapsed into ash. The smoke rose in a spiral. Another warning. Another deferred payment. On Christmas Eve, the voices tried something new. They sang. Soft carols at first, sweet and mournful, drifting from the trees. I hadn't heard music in years. For a moment my throat tightened with longing. But then the melody twisted, the words slurred. Voices breaking into laughter mid-verse. The sound curdled into a chorus of screams. I dropped to my knees, palms over my ears, rocking until my skull throbbed. Through the din, one voice cut sharper than the rest, Samuel's. "Open the door, Nathaniel. It's time." I almost did. The bolt quivered under my hand. My chest heaved. My body screamed to end it, to pay whatever price they demanded. But something deeper inside me held firm. Survival is obedience. I fell back, slamming my shoulder against the wall, screaming into the dark.
Not yet! Not yet!
The carols cut off like a knife. The silence that followed was worse. Silence always means the mountain is listening. When dawn came, the porch bore new scars. Not claw marks this time, but letters gouged deep into the wood. A single word. So, I sat for hours staring at it, my breath fogging in the frozen air. The mountain was patient, yes, but it was also certain. My time was running out. By January, I no longer dreamed of escape. I knew better. The mountain had bound me, as it had Samuel, as it had Caleb. All I could do was endure, wait, and hope the rules carried me another day. But the rules were failing. They no longer protected. They only delayed, and delay was a mercy measured in dwindling hours. One night, the lantern flickered and died, though the oil was full. Darkness swallowed the cabin. I lit another, but its flame sputtered the same. I grabbed a match. Everyone in the box crumbled to dust. I sat alone in blackness, so thick I could not see my own hand. The air grew heavy, pressing, and then the voices rose inside the room. Not outside, not at the windows inside, whispering inches from my ears. I spun, rifle raised, but there was nothing to aim at. "Pay it!" they breathed. "Pay it now." A hand brushed my shoulder, cold as stone. I fired blindly, deafening in the small room. The smoke cleared to silence, but the rifle jammed, and when I checked the floor, the bullet lay curled in a perfect spiral of lead, as though twisted by unseen hands. Rent was due. I could feel it in my bones, a countdown etched into marrow. The mountain would not wait much longer. The next rent night came with a sky clear of stars. I sat on the porch, lantern sputtering, and the forest breathed with me. The figures emerged, dozens, then hundreds, surrounding the clearing in a silent ring. They did not move, did not whisper. They only watched. In their midst stood Samuel. His eyes were gone, hollow pits. His mouth opened, and for the first time, his voice did not plead. It commanded. "Choose." I froze. My throat dried.
Choose what? Myself?
Another? The rules had never prepared me for this. The figures leaned closer, a wave of pressure pushing against the porch. "Choose." They whispered in unison, voices rattling my teeth. I screamed into the night. "No, I won't." But the word hung dead in the air. The crowd did not move, they waited. The rent would not be denied. When dawn came, they vanished. But inside the cabin, I found something waiting. A journal, old and worn, lying on the table where no book had been before. I opened it with shaking hands. The handwriting was Samuel's. Pages filled with rules I had never seen, warnings darker than any I knew. The final page bore one line, written in jagged ink. "Payment is blood, not yours, another's. Bring them or be taken." My stomach turned. The mountain had not spared me out of kindness. It had preserved me as a lure, just as Samuel had lured me years ago. The cabin is not a refuge. It is a trap, a tall booth in the wilderness, always demanding payment from someone, anyone, to keep the balance. Samuel had paid with me. Caleb had paid with himself. Now it was my turn to collect or surrender. I slammed the journal shut and shoved it into the stove. The flames devoured it hungrily, pages curling into ash. But the words had already burned into my mind. The rules had shifted into commandments I could not ignore. Payment would be demanded soon, and if I could not deliver another soul, the mountain would take mine. The spiral tightens. Rent is due. The journal's ashes lingered in the stove, but I could not burn away what I had read. Payment is blood, not yours, another's. Those words repeated in my head until they drowned out the silence of the mountain. For days, I walked the clearing like a man already condemned, muttering the old rules under my breath, trying to cling to the protections that had carried me this far. But they felt thin now, paper against a flood. The mountain had changed the terms. My rent was due. The snow thickened to the windowsills, pinning me deeper into the wilderness. I ate sparingly, slept rarely, and dreamed constantly. Always the same dream: Samuel, standing at the tree line, holding out his hand, whispering, "You know what to do." Behind him, faces stared with empty eyes. Joel, Caleb, strangers I'd never met, but somehow recognized from the other dreams. They stood in spirals, waiting. My waking hours were no better. The whispers crept into the cabin even by daylight, faint but insistent. Bring them. Bring them. At first I thought it was madness. Cabin fever, isolation, hallucinations born from hunger and cold. But then the proof appeared. On the porch one morning I found footprints. Not mine, not bare animal tracks, but fresh boots leading from the tree line to the door and stopping there. No trail away, no sign of retreat. As though someone had come and waited, invisible, inches from the threshold. The mountain was taunting me, dangling the promise of a choice. Deliver someone, or be delivered myself. I stayed inside for 3 days. Curtains drawn, stove choking with smoke. But on the 4th, I heard an engine echoing up the valley. At first I thought it was imagination, but then the sound grew closer. I stumbled to the window and saw headlights bobbing along the old dirt road. A truck. Real. Alive. Human. I nearly wept. It was a group of 3. 2 men and a woman, geologists. Judging by the equipment they unloaded. They parked near the trailhead, laughing, talking loudly over the wind. I pressed my face to the glass, heart pounding. I should have gone to warn them, told them to turn back before nightfall. That had always been my role, my duty. Instead, I stood frozen, the words from Samuel's journal burning like fire. Not yours, another's. I wrestled with it all day, pacing, muttering, gripping the rifle, then setting it down. Warn them or lure them. Save them or save myself. By dusk, the decision was made for me. I watched from the tree line as the trio set up camp near the clearing, pitching bright orange tents, laughing around a fire. They were close, too close. Already the forest had begun to bend toward them, branches creaking in unnatural rhythm. The mountain had scented them. Whether I acted or not, they were marked. That night, the voices came again, louder, sharper, filling the cabin. Bring them. Pay it. Now. The floor vibrated with the pounding of unseen fists. The lantern sputtered, shadows swelling against the walls. I clutched my head, teeth grinding. My choices were illusions. There was only one path left: rent must be paid. Near midnight, I stepped into the storm, snow biting my skin, rifle slung across my back. The geologist's campfire still smoldered, flickers of orange through the trees. I crept closer, every step an act of betrayal that made bile rise in my throat. I could see their faces clearly, young, bright, unscarred by the mountain's weight. They were telling stories, laughing softly, unaware of the thing that stalked them through me. I raised my voice, forced steadiness into it, and called out that I kept a cabin nearby, that the storm was too harsh, that they could find shelter with me. They hesitated at first, but exhaustion and cold made the choice easy. Relief shone in their eyes as they packed their things and followed me back along the trail. Each step I took felt like dragging chains. I wanted to scream at them to turn back, to run. But behind me, in the forest, I heard the crunch of something else walking, pacing us, hurting us. The mountain itself was listening, watching, waiting for its due. When we reached the cabin, I lit the lantern and gestured them inside. They piled in gratefully, thanking me, stamping snow from their boots. I forced a smile, hands trembling. My pulse thundered so loud I could barely hear their words. They spoke of their research, of rock samples, of seismic readings deeper in the range. Their voices were alive, warm, human. It was almost enough to break me. Almost. Then the knocking began. 3 times deliberate from beneath the floorboards. The sound froze me. The trio heard it too, glancing around, nervous. "Mice," I said hoarsely. "Just the old wood settling." They nodded uncertainly, but I knew better. The mountain was reminding me. Rent, now. The pressure in the air thickened, so heavy the lantern guttered low. Shadows wreathed along the walls, twisting into spirals. One of the men frowned, stepping toward the door. "We should go," he whispered to his companions. "Something's not right." He reached for the bolt. My body moved before my mind caught up. I slammed the rifle butt against the doorframe, blocking him. My voice cracked like a stranger's. "Stay. Inside." They recoiled, eyes wide with sudden fear. I wanted to tell them everything. The rules, the rent, the mountain's hunger. But the words stuck in my throat. Behind me, the knocking grew louder. Faster, until it was a constant pounding. "Do it," the voices hissed. "Do it now." My chest heaved, vision swimming. The woman screamed as the lantern blew out, plunging us into darkness. The cabin shook. Spirals of frost spread across the walls, glowing faintly, enclosing us like a cage. I don't remember pulling the trigger. I only remember the sound, the deafening crack, the scream that cut short the thud of a body hitting the boards. Silence followed, deeper than death. Then the pounding stopped. The air lifted. The spirals faded. Payment had been made. When I lit the lantern again, only 2 remained. They pressed themselves against the wall, eyes wide with terror, staring at me as though I were the monster. Perhaps I was. I told them to run, to take the road and never look back. They didn't wait for me to repeat it. They burst through the door and vanished into the snow. I watched their shadows stumble down the trail until the forest swallowed them whole. The body lay in the center of the cabin, blood pooled, steaming against the cold air. My stomach twisted. I wanted to bury it, to pray, to undo what I had done. But before I could move, the blood seeped between the floorboards, sucked down as though the cabin itself drank it. The boards shuddered once, then stilled. The body was gone. No trace remained except the stain on my hands. Rent had been collected. That night, I sat alone in the silence, lantern burning low. The mountain did not whisper. The shadows did not press. For the first time in months, the air was still. Peace, if it can be called that. But peace bought with blood is no peace at all. The next morning, fresh words were carved into the door, as though written by an invisible hand, annexed men th. My knees buckled. Of course. Rent is never paid forever. Rent is a cycle, endless, devouring. Samuel had paid with me. I had paid with another. Now the mountain would expect me to pay again, and again until nothing was left. I stared at those words until my vision blurred. My hands shook. I realized then that this was the trap Samuel had lived and died within. Not the rules, not the vigilance. The trap was survival itself. As long as you lived, you fed the mountain, and as long as the cabin stood, there would always be another tenant to collect. I thought of leaving again, but I knew it was pointless. The mountain would not let me go. The cabin would not release me. My choices were reduced to one: endure, obey, collect, or be collected. The snow fell heavier that day, burying the clearing, sealing me in. I sat by the stove, carving the rules into the table again with shaking hands, though I knew they would vanish by dawn. Still, I needed to see them, if only for a moment. At the bottom of the list I carved one final line, my own addition. There is no escape. The lantern flickered. The shadows swayed. From the tree line came a faint echo, low and rhythmic, like a voice repeating my name. I closed my eyes, whispering the rules one last time, clinging to the rhythm as if it were prayer. Rent is never truly paid. It is only ever borrowed. And I am running out of time. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I accepted a position as a fire lookout in the remote mountains of central Idaho. It sounded simple when I first read the description. Spend the summer alone in a tower, scan the forest for signs of smoke, and report anything unusual. I was 31 years old, unemployed after my last contracting job fell through, and desperate for work that would get me away from the city and its noise. At first glance, this seemed like a retreat more than a job, a way to breathe crisp air and remind myself that silence still existed in the world. I didn't know yet what kind of silence it would be. The contract had arrived by email, thick with disclaimers, all of them couched in the standard legal jargon. Buried at the bottom of the message, after the salary breakdown and the dates of employment, was a line in plain English that snagged my attention. Follow the rules provided by your supervisor. Do not deviate from them under any circumstances. I assumed it was a reminder not to get drunk on duty or to keep the radio charged. I signed without thinking. The drive to the base station took me through narrow roads that cut between jagged walls of stone and pine, choked valleys. Cell reception disappeared halfway up the mountain, leaving me with nothing but static and my own thoughts. By the time I reached the ranger station, dusk had fallen, painting the peaks in bruised shades of violet. The air smelled of resin and distant rain. A single truck sat outside the building, the kind of government issue white pickup with a cracked windshield and the emblem of the Forestry Service peeling off its side. Inside, the place smelled faintly of coffee gone sour. Behind the desk was a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same timber that built the place. He had a heavy brow, a jaw rough with stubble, and a presence that didn't invite small talk. He introduced himself as Supervisor Harker, though his name tag only read R. Harker. He spoke my name as though he were testing it against some mental ledger. "You're Mercer," he said, not asking. "Yes, sir," I replied. He slid a packet across the desk. It was thin, maybe 10 sheets, stapled unevenly in the corner. On the front in block letters were the words, Puart Okal OBSR of LR6. "These are your rules," Harker said. "You'll follow them exactly. Don't improvise. Don't second-guess them. If something doesn't make sense, assume you don't have the full picture." I flipped the cover page. The text wasn't the standard Forest Service guidelines I'd expected. No instructions about weather reports, no checklists about keeping binoculars calibrated. Instead, it was a numbered list written in stark, simple sentences. My eyes snagged on the first few. 1. Never leave the tower between midnight and 4 a.m. under any circumstances. 2. If you hear knocking at the trapdoor after dark, do not respond. 3. Should you see lights in the trees that resemble lanterns, radio me immediately. Do not attempt to make contact. I looked up, half expecting a grin on Harker's face, some acknowledgement that this was a joke played on rookies. He wasn't smiling. "These aren't guidelines," he said. "They're survival instructions." I opened my mouth to ask questions, but his gaze cut them short. "Read them carefully. You'll understand soon enough. Tower 6 is 20 miles north of here. Take the truck. You won't see another human until I come for you in 6 weeks. Radio me at sunrise and sunset every day. No exceptions. The ride to Tower 6 was a blur of dirt roads and switchbacks. By the time I arrived, night had settled in, thick and absolute. The tower rose from a rocky clearing, its silhouette a black tooth against the stars. Inside, the space was sparse: a cot, a wood stove, a desk with a radio, and glass windows on all sides. It felt less like a room, and more like being suspended in a lantern above the forest. The first night passed quietly. I read through the rest of the rules by lantern light, my unease growing with each line. They weren't written like official policy. They were written like warnings etched by someone who'd seen too much. Rule Fade 5 read, "If you notice the trees around the tower swaying, but there is no wind, shut the shutters and do not look outside until morning." Rule Fade 7 was worse. "If you see someone in the clearing waving at you, do not wave back, even if they look like someone you know." By dawn, I'd memorized the first half of them. It wasn't difficult. The human mind locks onto what frightens it. The days blurred into routine. I scanned the horizon for smoke, marked my logs, cooked simple meals on the stove. The radio crackled twice a day when I checked in with Harker, his voice curt, clipped, giving nothing away. The forest below stretched endlessly, a green sea broken only by ridges and river cuts. I should have felt peace, but instead there was a tension humming beneath everything, as though the silence was waiting for me to acknowledge it. On the third night, the first test came. I had been dozing on the cot. The lantern turned low. When the sound reached me, 3 sharp raps against the trapdoor at the base of the tower. My body froze. Rule Fade 2 came back in fulls. "If you hear knocking at the trapdoor after dark, do not respond." The knocks came again, slower this time, as though whoever, or whatever, was there was patient. I sat upright, holding my breath. The only light was the dim glow of the lantern, throwing long shadows against the wooden walls. I glanced at the clock. 20:13 a.m. squarely within the forbidden hours. I waited, counting the beats of my heart, until the knocking stopped. Silence returned, but it was not a comfortable silence. It was the kind that waits just outside the window, pressing in. I didn't sleep again until sunrise. The next morning, I told myself it must have been the wood contracting, or some animal brushing the structure. But when I stepped out onto the deck, I froze. In the dirt at the base of the stairs were prints. Not boots, not paws. Bare human feet, wide and darkened with soil, circling the tower. I didn't report it to Harker. My hand hovered over the radio more than once, but his words echoed. "Don't second guess the rules." Instead, I logged the day as normal and forced myself to believe the prints had been there before. By the 5th night, the forest was no longer just background. It was listening. When the wind died, the trees held themselves unnaturally still, as though waiting for a signal. And sometimes, just before dusk, I caught a faint glow between the trunks, like lantern light swaying where no path existed. That was when I truly realized the rules were not strange. They were necessary. The lantern glow between the trees grew bolder on the 6th night. I had just finished my evening check-in with Harker and was heating a tin of beans on the stove when the shimmer caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of reflection on the glass, a smudge of lamplight bouncing wrong. But then it moved against the slope, weaving between trunks, pausing as though to test if I was watching. I remembered Rule 23. Should you see lights in the trees that resemble lanterns, radio me immediately. Do not attempt to make contact. My hand hovered over the microphone, but fear made me hesitate. I didn't want Harker to think I was panicking at shadows, the rookie crying wolf less than a week in. The light pulsed, faint and rhythmic, as if mimicking a heartbeat. And then it split into two separate points swaying through the forest like partners in some unseen dance. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my breath fogging the glass as I leaned closer. I pressed the button on the radio. "Supervisor, this is Tower 6, I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I've got movement in the southern tree line. Lights, lantern-like. Static filled the cabin. For a moment, I thought the line had died. Then Harker's voice came, rougher than usual. "Shut your shutters. All of them. Now." I obeyed instantly. The shutters were heavy plywood boards on hinges, meant for storms. I lowered each one, sealing the tower in darkness, until only the glow of the lantern on my desk remained. The forest vanished. Harker didn't speak again. I sat in that coffin, dark silence for the rest of the night, every board creaking like a held breath. When dawn finally came, I opened the shutters with shaking hands. The clearing was empty. No prints. No sign of visitors. Only the forest, serene and green as though it had been that way forever. I wanted to believe I had imagined it, but deep down I knew I hadn't. Days passed without another sighting. I tried to force myself into rhythm. Cook, scan log, check in, sleep. But the rules sat on the desk like a second presence in the room, their black print louder than any radio crackle. My eyes drifted to Rule 87 more often than I wanted. If you see someone in the clearing waving at you, do not wave back, even if they look like someone you know. That one stuck to me like a burr. I thought of my mother's wave when I left town, my friend's wave when I drove away from the city. Ordinary gestures, made sinister by one line of ink. It was the 10th night when I heard the voice. It came around midnight, when the world below was a canvas of shadows. I had just settled into the cot when the radio crackled, not with static, but with words. At first, I thought it was Harker. "Mercer," it said, low and steady. "Calm down." I froze. The voice was mine. My own tone. My own inflections bleeding from the speaker. "You need to come down. It's safe now." I stared at the radio, my blood like ice. Rule 49 surfaced from memory. If you hear your own voice on the radio at night, turn the dial to static and leave it there until sunrise. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob and twisted. White noise roared into the room, a wall of meaningless sound. Still, I swore beneath it, I could hear my words, layered faintly like an echo pressing against glass. I kept the static hissing until the light of dawn broke across the horizon. The next morning, my eyes were raw, my nerves shredded. I told myself I would demand answers from Harker at sunset. When I keyed the mic at the scheduled time, I spat the words before he could even say hello. "What the hell is going on out here?" There was silence, then the faintest sigh. "You've read the rules," he said. "That's not good enough? Something's out there. Why the hell wasn't this in the contract? Why me?" Another long pause. Then, "Because you were willing. That's all it ever takes." Before I could ask more, he signed off, leaving me clutching the mic with white knuckles. The rules weren't just guidelines. They were a barricade, flimsy but necessary, between me and whatever this place harbored. By the 12th day, sleep had become a fragile, broken thing. I jumped at every creak of timber, every gust of wind rattling the shutters. My dreams, when I caught them, were steeped in repetition, knocking at the trap door, voices whispering beneath the floorboards, lights swaying just beyond reach, waking and sleeping blurred until both felt equally unreal. Then came the wave. It was afternoon, bright and almost too calm. I was scribbling notes into the logbook when movement caught my eye. Out in the clearing, just beyond the base of the stairs, someone stood. The figure was tall, shoulders hunched slightly, a jacket hanging loosely against the frame. My breath caught as my brain supplied a name: Evan, my younger brother. The likeness was uncanny. The same sharp jaw, the same uneven haircut he never bothered to fix. He raised his arm slowly, deliberately, and waved. The world narrowed to that single gesture. My first instinct was to wave back, to acknowledge him, to believe that somehow he had found his way here. Rule 87 pounded in my skull. Do not wave back, even if they look like someone you know. I gripped the desk to keep from moving. The figure held the wave, hand tilting side to side in mockery of patience. Then, as though realizing I would not break, he lowered the arm and turned. Without sound, he slipped into the tree line, swallowed by green. I didn't breathe for a long time. My fingers left dents in the wood of the desk. That night, I didn't light the lantern. I sat in complete darkness. The shutters cracked only enough for me to see the stars. My body ached from tension. I wanted to believe I'd hallucinated the whole thing, that isolation had begun to gnaw at my sanity. But when I checked the dirt below at sunrise, the prints were there, bare feet again, circling the tower, and a second set trailing away into the trees. By now, the forest was no longer just scenery. It had intention. The way the branches bent, the way the shadows pooled, it all felt like choreography designed to lure me into breaking one of those rules. I stopped asking why the rules existed. The better question was how long I could keep following them. The 14th night sealed the doubt. I woke to the sound of the trapdoor creaking open. My stomach dropped. Rule 52 had said not to respond to knocking. But this wasn't knocking. This was wood against wood, hinges groaning, the unmistakable sound of the barrier lifting. I sat bolt upright, staring at the square of black in the floor. It yawned open by inches, then held. My mind raced. The rules hadn't mentioned this. They hadn't told me what to do if the door didn't just beckon, but opened on its own. Something shifted in the dark gap. The faint scrape of skin on wood. Then a hand emerged, thin, gray, with too many knuckles, dragging itself onto the first rung of the ladder. I couldn't move. My body locked, as though any sound would draw it further. The hand paused, flexed, then retreated. The door slammed shut hard enough to rattle the windows. I sat there until morning, drenched in sweat, every nerve screaming. When light finally bled across the mountains, I staggered to the desk, grabbed the rule sheet, and flipped through it again, desperate to find something I had missed. At the bottom, in faded ink I swore hadn't been there before, was a new line. Rule 49. If the trapdoor opens on its own, do not interfere. Wait, it will close. I stared at the paper until the words blurred. The new rule wasn't typed in the same neat black as the others. It was thinner, almost handwritten, though no pen had touched the page. I wanted to tear it up, throw it into the stove, pretend it hadn't appeared. But the weight of what I'd seen the night before, the gray hand, the shifting knuckles, the trapdoor closing by its own will, anchored me in the belief that the rules weren't suggestions. They were alive, changing as the forest changed, binding me into a contract I hadn't agreed to but was already trapped inside. When I finally keyed the radio that morning, my voice shook. Harker. Something's wrong with the sheet. A new rule. It wasn't there before. There was silence, then the faint drag of his breath. Don't question the list, he said flatly. You're still alive, aren't you? That means it works. I wanted to scream at him, demand answers, but something in his tone froze me. He knew more than he'd ever admit, and my only lifeline was his voice crackling through static. So I swallowed the fury, logged my report, and signed off. The days blurred again. The forest pressed closer. The light shifted strangely in the afternoons, elongating shadows until they looked like bodies hanging between the trees. The wind carried whispers I couldn't decipher. Some nights I swore I smelled smoke, faint and acrid, though no fire burned. I clung to the list like it was scripture, reciting the rules in my head until I knew them better than my own name. On the 17th night, something changed. I had fallen into a shallow, restless sleep when a sound broke through the fog of dreams music. Not loud, not crisp, but distant, as if carried on the wind from a far-off carnival. A calliope tune, lilting and wrong, weaving through the pines. I sat upright, heart slamming. It wasn't in the rules. No mention of music. No guidance for what to do if the forest started singing. I crept to the window, peering through the glass. The clearing below was bathed in moonlight. At its edge stood three shapes. They were tall, impossibly tall, their limbs long enough to brush the ground, even as they stood upright. Each one held something glowing, swinging in slow arcs. Lanterns, or maybe not lanterns at all. The light wasn't fire. It was pale, greenish, like the glow of fungus on rotting wood. The music grew louder, though their movements made no sound. I backed away from the window, nearly tripping over the cot. My first instinct was the radio, but as I reached for it, words burned in my mind, as though whispered into my ear, "Don't call him. Don't call anyone." I froze. The voice wasn't mine, wasn't Harker's. It was something else. I dropped the mic as if it had burned me and dove for the shutters, slamming them down one by one until the tower was sealed again. The music didn't stop. It pressed through the wood, curling around me, teasing my nerves like plucked strings. I sat against the wall, eyes squeezed shut, whispering the rules aloud like a prayer until dawn. When the first light seeped in, the music ceased. I opened the shutters with trembling hands. The clearing was empty. The forest looked harmless again, but the memory of that tune stuck like a splinter in my brain. Later that morning, I checked the paper again, and there it was, another edition in that faint not quite ink. Rule 49: if you hear music, close the shutters. Do not seek the source. I laughed, sharp and bitter. It wasn't hysteria, not yet, but close. The rules weren't being written for me. They were being written because of me, adjusting to what I encountered, anticipating the next horror. When I reported that day, I didn't mention the music. I didn't want to hear Harker's evasions again. Instead, I asked the question that had gnawed at me since the beginning. "Supervisor, how many others before me?" The pause was long enough I thought he'd cut the transmission. Then, enough to learn the rules. Not enough to make them permanent. His voice clicked out. That was all I got. Enough. That night, I didn't sleep. I watched the forest instead, waiting for whatever came next. The silence was worse than the noise, because it meant anticipation, a coiled spring ready to snap. Around 2 in the morning, the knocking returned. 3 raps against the trapdoor, deliberate and patient. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The knocks came again, then silence. I almost relaxed. Then came the whisper. Right beneath the floorboards, pressed against the wood, my own voice spoke. "Daniel, let me in." I shook my head, teeth clenched so hard my jaw hurt. Another whisper, this one in a voice I hadn't heard in years, my father's. "Son, it's cold out here. Open up." Tears pricked my eyes. He had been dead for a decade, gone before I turned 20. The tone was perfect, down to the rasp of his smoker's cough. I clutched the rule sheet with white, knuckled hands, searching desperately for guidance. There was nothing. No line about voices beneath the floor. No instruction for when the dead came calling. For the first time, the list failed me. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, a chorus of familiar voices. Friends, family, all pressing, begging, demanding I let them in. My vision blurred with panic. I backed into the corner, slid down until I was curled on the floor, palms pressed to my ears. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. When I dared to look at the paper again, in the pale wash of dawn, there it was, Rule 513E. If they speak beneath the floor, do not answer, do not acknowledge. Survive until dawn. The edges of the page were worn now, the corners softening as though it had been handled for years instead of weeks. I thought of the others who must have clutched their own copies, waiting for new lines to appear. praying the rules came quickly enough to save them. I thought of those who hadn't lasted, who broke under the weight of temptation or fear. That day, the forest didn't look beautiful anymore. It looked like a cage. And the tower wasn't safety. It was a trap dangling above something patient enough to wait me out. By the 20th day, the rules had become less a lifeline and more a chain. I couldn't act without checking them, couldn't think without reciting them. I was living in reaction, never in control, and that was when I realized the real terror. The forest wasn't just trying to kill me. It was trying to break me into something that fit. That night, as the sun bled away, I whispered aloud to the empty cabin, "What happens if I don't follow them?" For a long moment, the silence held. Then, faintly, the radio crackled. Not Harker's voice, not mine, but something low and hungry, chuckling through the static. "You'll see." I didn't sleep. Couldn't. I sat upright in the dark, every muscle locked, staring at the trapdoor, waiting for it to rise again. By the 21st day, the rules were coming faster than I could prepare for them. Each dawn, when the forest light spilled across the desk, a new line waited for me in that faint, uncanny script. They never appeared while I was watching, but always when my guard slipped, like the page was being updated by something that knew the gaps in my focus. The newest one that morning raid rule, Fave warned through in a, "If you dream of leaving the tower, do not act on it when you wake. The dream is not yours." I stared at it for a long time, stomach hollow. The night before, I had dreamed of descending the stairs, of walking through the trees under a sky filled with strange stars. The forest had seemed welcoming, familiar, even beautiful in a way it never was by day. I had woken with a kind of ache, a longing to step outside and breathe the air beyond the clearing. That longing hadn't left me, even as I read the rule. I realized then how insidious this place was. It didn't just frighten, it seduced. It wanted me to step out willingly, to give myself up without a fight. The rules were a barricade not just against horror, but against temptation. That afternoon, I keyed the radio at check, in and spoke before Harker could. "The rules are multiplying," I said. "How many are there? How far does this go?" For the first time, he sounded tired, almost brittle. "As many as it takes." "Until what?" I pressed. He didn't answer. Static swallowed his voice, leaving me with nothing but the hiss of emptiness. That night, the dream came again. I walked barefoot through moss, moonlight pouring like milk between branches that bent low to guide me. In the dream, the rules didn't exist. There was no fear, no threat, just peace. When I woke, my body ached as if I had been climbing stairs all night. My hands trembled with the urge to open the trapdoor. Only the memory of Rule 514 kept me seated on the cot until dawn. By the 25th day, food tasted like ash. The beans, the rice, the canned fruit, all of it dulled, lifeless. I wondered if it was rot, or if the forest was stripping joy from everything I touched. Even water from the tower's tank carried a metallic tang. I forced myself to swallow it anyway, knowing that hunger and thirst would do the forest's work for it if I faltered. It was the 26th night when the tower itself turned against me. I had just shuttered the windows when the floor beneath me began to tremble. At first, I thought it was an earthquake, but the tremors were rhythmic, pulsing like a heartbeat. The boards shivered beneath my feet, rattling the lantern on the desk until it toppled and went out. In the sudden darkness, the tower moaned, a long groan of timber bending against pressure. I bolted upright, clutching the rule sheet in the dark. There was nothing on it about this. No line that told me what to do when the tower itself felt alive. When the walls closed in and the floor rippled underfoot. Then, just as my lungs burned from holding my breath, new words bled across the bottom of the page. Rule 45. If the tower shakes, do not run. Hold still. It will pass. I obeyed. I pressed myself against the wall, every nerve screaming to flee, to throw open the trapdoor and escape. But I held. The shaking rose to a violent shudder, then slowed, then ceased altogether. The boards lay quiet once more. My legs buckled, and I slid to the floor, clutching the paper like a lifeline. The next morning, the forest looked different. The trees were closer. I knew they shouldn't be. 20 feet of open clearing separated the tower from the first line of trunks. But they loomed nearer now, branches dipping low enough to brush the railings. Shadows stretched further across the ground, as though the sun itself had been dragged into a new position. By the 30th day, the isolation had hollowed me out. My thoughts came slow, words slippery in my mouth. I spoke less to Harker, my reports clipped to bare essentials. He didn't seem to mind. Once, I thought I heard him whisper something just before signing off, too faint to catch. I tried to call him back, but the line was dead. On the 32nd night, the music returned. This time it wasn't the lilting carnival tune. It was a low, steady hum, a single note vibrating through the wood and glass. My teeth ached with it. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the sound wasn't in my ears. It was in my bones. The paper waited on the desk. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see the inevitable new edition, but I couldn't help myself. When I turned my head, the faint ink was already there. Rule fixtixi, if the forest hums, do not move. Let it search. The hum swelled until the glass rattled. Shadows shifted beyond the shutters, shapes too tall, too thin, brushing past the tower as though circling prey. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me like water. My lungs begged for movement, for air, but I stayed still. Minutes stretched into hours until, at last, the hum faded. When dawn came, I opened the shutters. The clearing was different again. The dirt was covered in footprints, dozens of them, pressed deep into the soil. Not boots, not bare human feet either. Each one had too many toes, too long, trailing off into clawed tips. They circled the tower, leading in and out of the trees in spiraling patterns. I didn't call Harker that morning. What could I say? That something was tightening its grip around Tower 6, pushing closer each night. That the rules were being written faster, as though the forest itself was testing me with greater hunger. He would only say the same words, "Don't question the list." On the 35th day, I woke to find the paper different. Not just a new rule, but the entire page rewritten. The font was sharper, the lines darker, the rules reordered. Some were missing. You will not leave until you are dismissed. Rule Fate 2A, if something calls to you, ignore it. Rule Fine 3, if the forest moves, stay still. Rule 54A, and if the door opens, do not go through. The rest trailed off into half-formed sentences, smears of ink that dissolved into nothing. My chest tightened. The paper wasn't just updating. It was rewriting me into a different set of rules. When I tried to call Harker that evening, the line didn't connect. The radio hissed and spit, but no voice came back. I called again at dawn, then at dusk. Nothing. The realization sank in like ice. I was alone now. Not just physically, but severed. Whatever had kept me tethered to another human had been cut. The forest had what it wanted. Me. Bound to a shifting list that would tighten around my throat until I either obeyed it completely or broke beneath it. That night, the trapdoor opened again. But this time, nothing reached through. No gray hand, no whisper. Just a hollow, beckoning silence. The air pulled upward from the gap, carrying with it the scent of pine and rot. I gripped the desk, my whole body straining against the temptation to descend, to end this vigil, to step into whatever waited below. And then the page changed once more, right before my eyes. The letters burned dark and certain across the bottom. Rule 517E, when the silence comes, do not move. Do not speak, do not breathe. I obeyed. I sat frozen in the dark until the trapdoor slammed shut again. When dawn came, I realized my lungs still burned, my throat raw. I hadn't breathed for longer than should have been possible, and yet I lived, for now. By the 36th day, I wasn't sure whether the tower was keeping me alive or feeding me to something I couldn't name. The rules had stopped arriving in neat increments. They appeared whenever they pleased, sometimes at dawn, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes burning across the page in letters, so faint I had to squint until my eyes watered. I'd begun to fear the page itself more than the forest. At least the forest showed its teeth in the form of lantern lights, knocking, whispers. The paper was sly, insidious, rewriting reality beneath my nose. Each new line meant some horror I hadn't faced yet, some test waiting outside the tower. On the 37th morning, I woke to find the sheet nearly covered. Rules stretched from top to bottom, some repeating themselves, others contradicting what came before. One in the middle read, "Do not trust Rule 84. Another said, "If the ink turns red, burn the page." The problem was, I didn't know which lines were permanent and which were bait. Was the list protecting me or manipulating me? My hands shook as I traced the words, trying to memorize them, but they slipped away like water through fingers. That afternoon, I made a mistake. It was small, so small I almost convinced myself it didn't count. I was scanning the ridges when movement caught my eye. A figure stood at the tree line, half in shadow. Not waving, not beckoning, just standing. The angle of the shoulders, the slope of the head. It looked exactly like me. My own reflection carved into flesh. The rules had said nothing about this. Waving, yes. Voices, yes. But not this. Not a double waiting in the trees. I should have shut the shutters. Should have looked away. Instead, I stared. My reflection tilted its head at the same moment I did. But then, slowly, its mouth stretched wide. Too wide. Wider than skin should allow. Rows of teeth unfolded like blades catching the sun. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair. When I looked again, it was gone. That night, a new line scrawled across the bottom of the sheet. Rule 518E, if you see yourself outside, do not look too long. I had failed it already. The following days blurred into a haze of sleepless hours and gnawing dread. Food ran lower, and what remained tasted fuller each time. I rationed water, my tongue dry and cracked. The forest pressed closer. Branches scraped against the windows. Shadows shifted across the walls even when the lantern was out. I stopped opening the shutters during the day. The trees felt too close, their bark writhing with faces I almost recognized. On the 40th day, the radio crackled back to life. Mercer. The voice was Harker's but faint, distorted. Relief hit me so hard I nearly wept. I grabbed the mic, clutching it like salvation. I'm here. I'm still here. The rules, they're changing. It won't stop. Static swallowed him. Then his voice returned, low and urgent. Burn the list. I froze. Burn it. That was the only thing keeping me alive. I thought of Rule 81, the original version. Never leave the tower between midnight and 4 a.m. If I destroyed the paper, would I still remember them all? Could I trust myself not to falter? Burn it, Harker repeated. Then the line cut dead. I stared at the stove for a long time. My hands trembled as I fed a scrap of kindling into the fire, the page clutched in the other hand. I couldn't do it. If I destroyed it, and the rules vanished from my memory, I'd be defenseless. And yet a sick part of me wondered if keeping it was the very thing feeding the forest, letting it write itself deeper into me. That night, the trapdoor opened again. Silence poured up through the gap, heavy and waiting. I pressed my back to the wall, clutching the rule sheet like a shield. And then the letters began to move. Not just new ones appearing, but the entire page shifting, rearranging into a single sentence written over and over. Openin, The. I squeezed my eyes shut, heart pounding. The boards groaned under pressure, as though something vast and heavy pressed against the ladder. The air stank of soil and rot. I lasted until dawn, but when the light broke, the trapdoor was still ajar. I forced it shut with both hands, the wood warm as though touched by flesh. The paper that morning was blank. Every rule, every line, gone. I almost collapsed. The page that had dictated every breath of my existence for 5 weeks was now empty. A clean slate. My first thought was relief, but terror replaced it quickly. Did the absence mean I was free, or that the forest had no more need of instructions? That day, I paced the tower until my legs ached. I tried the radio, calling Harker over and over, but only static replied. By evening, exhaustion overtook me. I collapsed onto the cot, clutching the blank paper like it still meant something. And then I dreamed. I was standing in the clearing, barefoot, the dirt cool against my skin. The forest was quiet, serene. The tower loomed above me, windows dark, shutters closed. In the dream, I climbed the stairs slowly, every step echoing. When I reached the top, I opened the trapdoor and pulled myself inside. The tower was empty. No lantern, no cot, no stove. Just walls covered floor to ceiling with rules scrawled in black. Hundreds of them, thousands, looping endlessly. Some I recognized, others were gibberish. At the center of the room stood a figure hunched over the desk, writing. It was me. I woke with a scream, the paper clutched in my hand. Except it wasn't blank anymore. Across the top, in jagged black, was one new line rule. Mindine, you are the one writing. I dropped it like it was venomous, stumbling back against the wall. My skin crawled, my head buzzing with a memory I wasn't sure was real. Had I dreamed that figure? Or had I been standing outside the tower looking in? For the rest of the day, I didn't touch the paper. I left it on the desk, its single line facing the ceiling like an accusation. By nightfall, the hunger in my belly had grown sharp, but the thought of eating turned my stomach. I was unraveling. Thread by thread, the 44th night, I heard footsteps inside the tower. Not below, not outside, inside. They paced across the floorboards while I sat rigid on the cot, every muscle locked. The lantern was dim, casting long shadows that wavered with each creak of the wood. I forced myself to turn my head. The desk chair was occupied. Someone sat hunched over the rule sheet, shoulders bent, hand moving in quick, scratching motions. The lantern light glinted off pale skin, stretched too thin over bones. Its head turned slowly, and I saw my own face staring back, eyes hollow, mouth slack. I blinked and it was gone. The chair empty. The paper blank again. I wanted to run. I wanted to throw myself down the stairs and into the forest, even if it meant being torn apart. But the rules, or the absence of them, still held me in place. Obedience had become my only muscle memory. When dawn came, the paper bore one final line, rule fait-29, do not forget who you are. It was the first rule that didn't sound like a command. It sounded like a plea. I didn't know if it was written by the forest, by Harker, or by myself. Maybe all three. Maybe it didn't matter. Because by then, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. By the 45th day, I no longer trusted the sun. It rose too late, set too early, dragging shadows longer than they should stretch. Sometimes when I blinked, I swore there were two suns, pale and weak, orbiting each other in a sky I didn't recognize. The forest below had shifted too. The clearing was smaller, the tree line pressed nearly against the tower. Branches brushed the windows in the breeze, though the rules had taught me enough to know there was no breeze. The paper sat on the desk, the single line glaring at me. Rule fait-20, do not forget who you are. It was different than the others. Not a command of survival, but something deeper, personal. Yet it frightened me more than the rest, because what if I already had forgotten? What if the forest had stripped me down so far that Daniel Mercer was only a name left on a piece of paper? The hunger gnawed sharper every hour. Supplies were nearly gone. tin scraped clean, water turning rancid. My ribs pressed against my skin, my hands shook with weakness. It was no longer just fear that could kill me. It was my own body collapsing. On the 46th night, the forest knocked again. Not at the trapdoor, not on the walls, but directly on the windows. A sharp, insistent tapping that traveled from pane to pane, circling me. I clutched the paper, whispering the rules aloud, though most had vanished. Don't answer. Don't move. Don't breathe. My voice broke into sobs, my throat raw. The knocking stopped. In the silence that followed, a voice whispered through the glass, "Daniel, you've done so well. Just one more rule." I froze. The paper lay blank before me, the ink beginning to crawl again. My chest tightened as new words etched themselves across the page. Rule Fate 20 once and opened the door when called. I shook my head violently, the lantern rattling on the desk. "No, that breaks everything," the rules said. My own voice cracked. The rules had said not to open the trapdoor, not to leave the tower. But the forest was rewriting its contract, dangling escape like bait. I paced the cabin, mind unraveling. If I followed this new rule, was I obeying or betraying the old ones? If I disobeyed, was I clinging to a set of lies that had only ever meant to cage me? At midnight, the trapdoor creaked open again. Not violently this time, but gently, almost tender, like a parent opening a bedroom door to check on their child. A soft glow rose from below, lantern light, green and pulsing. The smell of earth drifted up, damp and rich, strangely comforting. The radio crackled behind me. Harker's voice, ragged, almost broken. "Mercer, do not go down. Whatever it says, whatever it shows you, stay inside. This is the last test." Tears blurred my vision. Then why did the rules change? I screamed into the static. Why does it tell me to open the door now? Silence. Then, because it knows you're tired. The line went dead. I staggered to the trapdoor, staring into the glow. My own reflection stared back from the black wood of the ladder, warped and grinning. The hunger in my body screamed for release, for anything but another night of endurance. My fingers curled around the edge. The paper changed again. Rule cater table. Choose, that was it. No command, no direction, just a demand. My breath rattled in my lungs. Every rule before had been survival by obedience. Now it demanded something else. Responsibility. Maybe the final trap was choice itself. I shut my eyes. Thought of my brother's wave, my father's voice beneath the floor, my own double grinning at me from the trees. None of it was real. Or maybe all of it was. But the rules had always been about one thing, keeping me inside. I let go of the trapdoor and stumbled back, collapsing against the wall. The glow below pulsed, angry now, the air shaking with it. A sound rose from the forest. Not knocking. Not music, but a chorus of screams woven together, my voice among them. The tower shook, timbers groaning, glass rattling. The paper burned on the desk without flame, the words searing brighter until they vanished in ash. The trapdoor slammed shut, hard enough to rattle dust from the rafters. Then silence. When dawn broke, the clearing was empty again. The trees had retreated, leaving 20 feet of open dirt, as though nothing had ever pressed closer. The air was clean, sharp with morning. The paper was gone. In its place on the desk sat my radio log, open to the first page. My own handwriting filled it from start to finish. Every line of every rule scrawled by my hand. I turned the pages with trembling fingers, and each bore my script, not the faint ink I'd grown used to. Had I written them all along? Had Harker ever existed? Or had the forest used my own mind to trap me, to feed itself on my obedience? The radio crackled once more, faint and steady, a voice calm and unfamiliar. "Tower 6, this is base. Rotation's over. Your relief will arrive today. Good work, look out." I stared at the mic, unable to move. My throat worked, but no words came out. Hours passed. By noon, a white truck appeared at the edge of the clearing, sunlight glinting off the windshield. A man climbed out, young, clean, shaven, carrying a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He shaded his eyes against the sun, looking up at the tower. He raised his hand and waved, every muscle in my body locked. Rule 47 thundered through me. If you see someone in the clearing waving at you, do not wave back. The wave held, patient, almost cheerful. The man shouted, "You must be Mercered." "I'm here for the next shift." I stood at the window, trembling, unable to tell whether this was freedom or the cruelest trick of all. The rules were gone, the page ash, but they lived in me now, carved deeper than bone. My hand twitched at my side, aching to rise, to wave back, to prove I was still human. But I didn't. I couldn't. I only watched, and the forest watched with me.